to the AFCEA Mini-Bootcamp, Never Break the Chain, Lessons Learned About Resilience and Supply Chain in the Cloud. My name is Thomasina Hammond, and I am part of the CompTIA team. And just a couple of things before we get started with today's event that I would like to review. We do have some people in the room live, and we do have some people online. So for those online, just a couple of things. You can ask questions through our Q&A widget or through the group chat. And for those folks in the room, if you want to jot this down, our moderator today is Dr. James Stanger from CompTIA, and any questions that may come up throughout the next few hours, you can direct to James at jstanger@comptia.org. So with that, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Stanger.
Well, thank you so much, man. Thank you very much, Thomasina. Welcome from Olympia, Washington. Normally I'm there at AFCEA, but couldn't make it this time, so apologies for not being there in person. Again, I'm the Chief Technology Evangelist at CompTIA. That's me kayaking there in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. I've done a lot of work over the years working with IT professionals, people at the Department of Defense, et cetera, talking about the cloud, talking about security, et cetera. But for those of you who don't know who we are, we're CompTIA, not CompTIA or CompTIA, we're CompTIA. We do education, certifications, of course, but we have a membership program. We do a tremendous amount of research as well. We're going to be talking to you a little bit about that. But because we represent the industry, we're very lucky to bring in a fantastic group of people here. So we've got basically a 3-hour tour here, if I remember Gilligan's Island, a 3-hour show here, where we're going to be talking with Alan Whipple and a gentleman first hour named James Morrison. Alan and James are going to be talking about supply chain security. Second hour, we've got a fantastic panel from GDIT, and then the third hour, I'll be talking with Phil from Rackspace. So our speakers, we have fantastic speakers. So for example, Alan and James, there are their pictures, there's Phil, and then Ken has brought in a fantastic group of folks there. So make sure, folks, that if you have any questions, again, feel free to contact me via email or via the Q&A or the attendee chat. We have Kevin Kinzer has told everybody hello. Greetings, everybody there in Augusta. If you're calling in from elsewhere, tell us where you are there in the chat window. So it's fantastic to have you here. Trevor, you're too young for Gilligan's Island? Nobody's too young for Gilligan's Island. So great to have everybody here. Well, first, for the first hour, I want to mention a couple of things. First of all, this event is approved for continuing education credits for A+, Network Plus, Security Plus, Linux Plus, and Cloud Plus. But more importantly, we've got Alan Whipple. How you doing, Alan?
Doing great. Excited to be here today.
It's good to have you here. And you're calling in from Salt Lake City, is that right?
That's right. Beautiful Salt Lake City.
Okay, so I'm starting here in Olympia, which is on the West Coast, and then we got Salt Lake City moving further in. James, where are you calling in from, man? Oh, can't hear you, James.
Oh, sorry. I was just bringing up video. So yeah, I'm down here in Houston, Texas, watching the storms roll in again as they've been doing over the last few days.
So, what is it? Riders on the Storm, right? We got Jim Morrison here. So
Riders on the Storm. Yeah, we get karaoke, we can roll with it, but you know.
I'm sure I was talking with everybody. I was talking to James earlier. He's heard every Jim Morrison Doors joke in the world, but I thought that Riders on the Storm was pretty slick. I thought it was pretty good.
Well, when I used to play military soccer, it was break on through to the other side. It was what I heard all the time. So, you know.
That works. That works. And then Alan, Whipple. Anybody old enough to remember the Charmin commercials, right? So I mean, we have true stars here to talk about in our first hour to talk about the supply chain. So Alan, thank you so much, and thank you so much HPE for the two of you for the next hour or so. So why don't I turn the time over to you, Alan? You're going to be doing some talking, right? And then you and James are going to be doing some conversations about the supply chain. Is that right?
Absolutely, James. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to be here today and to talk about what HPE is doing when it comes to not only security, but specifically supply chain security. There's a lot of great messaging, and we're going to jump right into it. As James mentioned, my name is Alan Whipple. I've been with Hewlett Packard Enterprise for just over 13 years and have held various roles throughout that time, from being partner business managers to managing teams to now being the North America server security and server management subject matter expert. So that's a long title if you've ever heard one, but long story short, I love talking about security specific to our servers. I love talking about supply chain security and what we're doing at HPE to address that. And I know without a doubt we have the most compelling message and security strategies in place. And that's what we want to help you understand today. A little bit more about myself. I am from just north of Salt Lake City. I actually grew up in Salt Lake, but moved just north to a town called Bountiful, Utah, just up on the mountainside. I have 4 kids, 2 girls, 2 boys, a beautiful wife, and I've lost most of my hair already. So we are making progress in this life, but very happy to be here with you today. And when we get to the portion with the live Q&A with James, we're going to have some discussion around supply chain security. I'll have him introduce himself. So without further ado, I want to talk about what HPE is doing with server security and supply chain security. My goal is to never get too technical, but to speak to a level where you understand our technologies. That's the goal I have in place for you today. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A box. I get a little bit excited, so if you need to, feel free to cut me off, but I'll try to take breaks where you can ask questions as well. So my agenda for you for the next roughly 30 minutes is I want to do a security overview. What is HPE doing to help you with security, specifically in the supply chain? What security functionalities do we have in place down inside of our servers? We're not necessarily going to spend time talking about network security and firewall security. We're going to get into the supply chain portion of it. We're going to talk about some of those specific features and how we manage our servers. And then one of the exciting announcements we have today is our trusted supply chain offering, which, hint, hint, is all about a made in the USA server that we offer at HPE. And then we'll wrap it all together with our latest announcement that was literally just a month and a half ago with our HPE Compute Cloud Console. At that point, I'll take some questions, and then I'll bring James on, and we're just going to talk candidly about what we're seeing in the world of cybersecurity. And I love this part of our presentation because James came to HPE from the FBI, specifically the Cyber Task Division. So he has seen a lot of interesting things when it comes to cyber attackers. He has some great stories, some great insight to talk about. So that's the agenda, wanting to know where we're headed. And with that, let's start with a security overview. So when we look at the world and we say, what in the world is going on right now with cybersecurity? We know that for the past 10, even 20 years, data has become the new currency. We know that cyber attackers are going out there saying, if we can get our hands on data, we can then turn it around and sell it for lots of money or demand ransoms from these companies that we take data from. But guess what? We're seeing a new weapon from the cyber attackers, and that is now called the loss of function. So if you're a cyber attacker, imagine, let's say, you can gain access to a car manufacturing facility and you take that facility offline. Now that's a unique situation and a unique challenge for that car manufacturing facility. They don't have the time to go pivot and say, okay, let's look at our cyber liability policy. Let's see if we can play the game of going back and forth how much we need to pay. When their facility is offline, every minute counts. So what do? They pay that ransom almost immediately. And James can speak more to that later on. But we're seeing this loss of function be the new focus of cyber attackers. So what we're trying to do with supply chain security and our HPE security message in general is to do 3 things. We want to give our customers the ability to protect against new vulnerabilities quickly, and then detect those intruders who gain access and pivot to a recovery action immediately. So we would like to get on this call today in this training and say, you know what, you buy HPE servers, you're bulletproof. Nobody can say that. But what we can say is we're going to give you the tools to detect those intruders and to pivot to an automated recovery strategy quickly. So the good news is that customers are getting the message, right? From 2012 to 2019, we saw a 70% increase in cybersecurity spending, meaning customers are saying we need to beef up our infrastructure, we need to do everything that we can. The good news is from 2020 to 2026, or the better news, I should say, is we're going to see an additional $98 billion spent, or another 65% increase in cybersecurity spending. So we know the message is getting out there. It's no surprise. It's almost every single week we get a big news article that says so-and-so company has been hacked. They're dealing with that hack. How much data was exposed? Unfortunately, that's going to continue to happen, but we want to discourage the cyber attackers from coming our direction to HPE when you utilize our servers and our server management tools. So a couple statistics here to help paint the picture, and it looks like the period disappeared off my slide, but $10.5 trillion is how much cybercrime will cost the world economy by 2025. As I've trained on this for the last couple of years, it was a couple trillion, then 6 trillion, and now 10.5 trillion. So that number, no surprise, is going to continue to climb. Now, this one is one of my newest statistics that really hits home to me. Cybercrime is now more profitable than the global drug trade. Just let that sink in for a moment. We know that for the longest time, so much money is made in the global drug trade, but cybercrime has now surpassed that, and it makes cyber criminals a lot of money. 11 seconds, that's the time that a business has become a victim of ransomware. So as we go through this wonderful 3-hour, boot camp today or training, countless businesses are going to have to realize, do they have a good plan in place? Do they have equipment that's protecting them? And hopefully they do. 6 billion people will be connected to the internet interacting with data next year by 2022. The more people that are connected and interacting with data, the more targets for our cyber attackers. Another one I like, and I promise I'm almost done with the statistics, but they do help paint the right picture. 30 million small businesses in the US. And I don't want you to say, oh, I'm a small business, I'm not going to suffer a cyber attack. Cyber attackers don't delineate, right? They're going to say, we'll go after anybody and any business anywhere. And so don't have that false sense of security, no pun intended. 3 times more network devices on Earth than humans by 2023. And that goes back to that conversation that I just had. The more devices that are connected, that's more access points for cyber attackers to gain access to data and your equipment. So it begs the question, are you truly protected? And as we talk today and you start thinking about some of these statistics and items I'm talking about, please be honest with yourself. Please say, I could be doing more. Or I don't even really know where my business is when it comes to cybersecurity. Be honest with yourself, address it. Please take the necessary steps to procure the right hardware infrastructure. And we're going to provide some of those solutions with our HPE message today. That being said, I kind of want to pivot to what we offer and how we can help. So HPE, their security vision is focused on a bottom-up defensive approach. So most companies say, we're going to protect from the firewall down, meaning they're looking at it like a castle. So let's say you have a castle and you say, we are going to build a moat around that castle. We're going to have a drawbridge. We are going to prevent anybody from coming into that castle. But what if there are bad actors inside the castle already? That approach isn't going to work. So HPE, with their, bottom-up defensive approach, they're saying, not only are we going to build the moat around that castle, not only are we going to have the drawbridge, but we are going to continually vet every single person that's inside that castle and make sure they are who they claim to be and that they are not cyber attackers or ransomware or viruses, if you will. So we start all the way at the supply chain. That is the focus, not even when our servers are turned on, but well before that. And that's what we are committed to, and we want you to know that when you work with HPE. So to give you a little bit of history on how we do that, we introduced the world's most secure industry standard server back in June of 2017 at our Discover event. And now we just announced our Gen 10 Plus servers a couple months ago back in May, but it's all focused around what we call our ILO 5 chip. Now, we didn't give ourselves this lovely marketing tagline, the world's most secure industry standard server. When we released that Gen 10 server 4 years ago, we went to 2 third-party pen testing companies, and we asked them to take a look at our servers, to tear them apart, to evaluate them, and tell us where our vulnerabilities are. They're the ones that came back and said, wow, HPE, based on what you're telling us, you have the world's most secure industry standard server, and you're up to 2 generations ahead of what the competitors are doing. Now, that was 4 years ago, and guess what? We are still leading the charge. And I want to talk about exactly what that means. So the ILO 5 chip, and I'll come back to this slide. I'll give you a better view here. The ILO 5 chip, which is circled on this server from a top-down view, is our server management chip. there are a lot of names for it. Server management chip, server ASIC, server BMC. Essentially, the first place your server goes when you press the power button. Now, as I promised, I'm not going to get super technical, but I need you to understand where this differentiates HPE and gives you that strong supply chain messaging. That ILO 5 chip is completely designed by us at HPE. So it's not an off-the-shelf chip that we would buy from one of our fabricators. It's actually designed by us, and it is our chip. Excuse me for the sneeze there. So it's our design, and then it's our firmware that we literally embed in that chip as it's fabricated. And because of that, it allows us to do some very unique things. Number one, it's our design. We know that fabricators and in the supply chain, they can't replicate that chip because it's ours. Number two, our firmware is in that chip, so it's not just generic firmware. So we have control of that firmware code, and we have control of that design. But with that, and tying it into our HPE ProLiant Gen 10 and Gen 10 Plus servers, we can set it up to do some really cool things. Number one, we can set our servers to do daily firmware checks while the server is running. So when you buy our servers and you say, man, how am I utilizing the supply chain security? How am I utilizing all of these security features with HPE servers? You can set them up. You can set them to check your essential firmware components once every day. Now, in the unlikely event that compromised firmware is detected, it's going to pivot and flash to the last known good state of firmware, which is stored on that ILO 5 chip. And it's going to do it automatically. That's a game changer, right? So no longer do you have to take your server offline and say, well, you know what, I'm going to take it offline, I'm going to reboot it and verify everything. This is happening while your server's running, and if it finds any compromised firmware, it's going to automatically recover to a last known good state. You just have to go in and set it up, and it is off and running. So one other thing I want to highlight is how we do this compared to other server vendors out there. So on the left-hand side, our other server vendors have similar types of technologies, but they do not verify all of the essential firmware components and give you the option to recover those components. This slide's a little intimidating, but if you go to the right-hand slide, all it's meant to demonstrate is from our custom HPE chip or our ILO 5 chip up the stack. It's going to verify all of the essential firmware components, and it will recover all of those in the event of a cyber attack. Just want you to be aware of that. So now that we've talked about kind of where the magic's that ILO 5 chip that we design and that ILO firmware that goes on that chip. I want to talk about some of our server management and security features that really help secure our message. So what I did is I put a slide together that really highlights 6 of my favorite security features, and a lot of these tie into the secure supply chain messaging. And we'll start on the upper left-hand corner. Number 1, if you're concerned about, a server going from one location to the next, or you want to make sure this is installed before it even leaves the factory, we offer a chassis intrusion detection switch. Once again, I like the big long terms that HPE uses, but that's essentially just a switch we install under the lid of the server. So anytime someone pops open the lid of that server, it's going to log it via our ILO audit log. Even if that server does not have power, it's still going to pick that up because it's tied to a battery-backed solution. So the next time you turn that server on, it's going to alert you and say, hey, at 2:56 p.m., somebody opened your server, whether it was powered on or whether it was shipping from the factory or it was on a truck, right? So we have that option. On the upper right-hand side, we have our Marsh Cyber Catalyst designation, which, in a nutshell, is a cyber liability company we work with. They believe so much in HPE's Gen 10 and Gen 10 Plus servers that we're going to offer enhanced terms and conditions on our cyber liability policies. So if you're looking at cyber liability policies and you want to strike a better deal, we have that lined up with the Marsh Cyber Catalyst designation. The right-hand side is that silicon root of trust that I just talked about. That's that ILO 5 chip. That's completely our design and our chip at HPE. The bottom right-hand side is a really cool feature called the one-button secure erase. So when we talk about the supply chain security, right, let's look at the back side of that when we want to end of life a server, right? And we want to make sure that all that data is successfully wiped clear off that server. We have what we call a virtual one-button secure that you press that goes out and it erases everything on that server to NIST compliant standards. So now you don't have to go in and say, okay, did we wipe everything off the hard drives? Did we wipe everything off the smart array controller? What about the cache on the memory? it takes care of all that, including the security settings, user information, etc. The bottom left-hand side is that server system restore that we talked about. And then the left-hand side is one of my favorite features. It's called the server configuration lock. And this ties into the supply chain security very, very well. So we have an option to, when you build our servers, we can turn on what's called a server configuration lock that locks down the configuration of the server exactly how it was at the factory. Now, if somebody gets their hands on that server in transit and they pull out a hard drive, they pull out a memory DIMM, and even put that exact same memory DIMM back in the slot, or try to change firmware or security settings, the next time you turn that server on, before it allows it to boot, it's going to pop up a screen that says the configuration of this server has changed. Either A, enter the password and you're aware of this, or B, you've got to figure out who's been tampering with your server. But here's the cool part: your server's not going to boot until you put that password in. So that ransomware, that malware, that virus cannot fully execute because the server's not booting. That's called the server configuration lock. So a lot of these really cool features come standard with our server. So when you buy an HPE ProLiant server, it's going to come with ILO. That ILO 5 chip's part of the motherboard. It's going to come with ILO standard, the tool to manage all that. But to get a lot of the features I talked about specific to supply chain security and security in general, you're going to need ILO Advanced to do that. So I want you to be aware of that. Anytime you're looking at HPE servers and their messaging, make sure you have ILO Advanced that goes with that. So we address a lot of concerns with our server management tool of ILO. When people say, man, setting up my server takes too long. How can I protect my server? Is my server secure? The threats are crazy right now. ILO solves that. And I spent a lot of time talking about that ILO 5 chip, and that's really where a lot of that happens. Because our cyber attackers, they can't get in there and change the coding in that ILO 5 chip. It can't happen. It's immutable. There's a digital connection within that chip. And that's the strong part right there. And that's the benefit of HPE making their own server management chip, is it's not an off-the-shelf chip that somebody could get their hands on before the server's even built. So a couple of our server management solutions that tie into all these security features. You've heard me talk about ILO a lot, and I'm sorry if I didn't take my time to explain it. ILO is our tool to manage our servers. As I mentioned, it comes included free, but there is a paid version that unlocks all the features. HPE OneView is like a brain of server management tools. So if you want to manage your networking, your storage, your servers, you want to come in and schedule firmware updates, you want to have server templates that you can roll out, HPE OneView is the tool for that, which I recommend for large-scale environments. And then we have HPE InfoSight, which uses predictive analytics to identify problems and resolve them before they occur. And it does that by pulling together servers in the cloud. So you connect your servers to InfoSight, it pulls together servers all throughout the world. Let's say an issue that commonly occurs maybe in Europe, it will find the resolution for that, and it'll roll it out to all the other servers on that network. And it's all doing this automatically with AI in the background, which is a super cool feature. And that's free when you buy our servers. So before I pivot more hard into the supply chain aspect of what we're doing, I want you to know that we do offer workshops where we go through and we show you live demos of all of our tools. So if you like what I've said so far today, please feel free to go and join one of our server security and automation workshops. But now I want to get into one of our exciting announcements that plays very beautifully with today's conference, and that's our trusted supply chain offering from HPE. So back in October of 2020, we announced our new trusted supply chain offering, specifically focused on making sure from the moment our components are sourced to when we build our servers and then deliver them, you're getting a secure experience. So this offering is based out of our Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin facility. And what it is it's a made in the USA offering, which we're very excited to offer. So since it's built in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, we've aligned with the National Defense Authorization Act in the United States. And they're the ones that, pretty much say, in order to be made in the USA, you need to follow these guidelines. So we align with those guidelines. They get very specific in that National Defense Authorization Act, to the point where they even spell out, certain Chinese provinces you cannot source components from, like Hawaii, ZTE, Hytera, for example. So we make sure that we're always in lockstep with the NDAA. and then they say you have the Made in the USA offering. So it's only available on specific servers, our DL360 and our DL380, which are our two most popular rack mount servers. What we're going to do is we're going to make it in our Chippewa Falls, or assemble it in our Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin facility, and then we're going to turn on or enable all of the, or several of the security features that I just talked about, and I'll walk through those real quick. But here's the cool thing now is we can go out to our federal customers, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, those are some of our customers, and say, hey, we're aligning with some of the new presidential orders from President Biden to source Made in the USA servers. You can have the confidence of knowing from the moment that server was not just turned on, but assembled, the components were verified by U.S. citizen HPE employees, and they verified it in a secure location, so you can't just waltz right into the Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin facility. It's not going to happen. It's securely locked down. But you can get a server from that facility now, and we can even offer options of having a dedicated truck and a dedicated driver from the moment it leaves our facility to the moment it arrives on your customer site, anywhere in the 48 continental United States. So it's a really cool offering. Let me clarify. A lot of people say, well, of course, Alan, not every nut, not every bolt and screw is made in the USA. No, it's not, but we align with that National Defense Authorization Act. So a couple things that we do. We're going to go into the ILO, which I talked about. We're going to bump the server into high security mode. What that does is it makes it that much more difficult for a cyber attacker to gain access. It locks down the authentication of the server, makes it difficult to access. We're going to turn on that UEFI secure boot if you decide to have an operating system installed. So it essentially takes that root of trust verification all the way up to the operating system bootloader. We're going to enable that server configuration lock feature that I talked about. We're going to turn it on at our factory before it leaves, so we can ensure that if anyone gets their hands on that server and tampers with it, we will know. We're going to install that chassis intrusion detection device for you. So if that somebody tries to pop open the lid of that server, we're going to know exactly what time that happened and when it happened. And then we're going to wrap it all together with some specialized delivery services. As I mentioned, if you have the desire for a dedicated truck and a dedicated driver, we have that option for you. So this is our trusted supply chain Made in the USA offering. The server itself, and you can't see very well on this slide, actually has a label on it that says trusted supply chain with an American flag. We are the only major server vendor that can offer this at scale, meaning if you have 500, 1,000 servers tomorrow that you need, it's available. We can do that for you all through our Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin facility. So we're very excited about this offering. We're coming up on the year mark, and we are seeing great success with it and a lot of great attention to this. Last but not least, before we pivot and have a Q&A session and then an open discussion with James Morrison, is the Compute Cloud Console. This is our most recent announcement as of literally about 90 days ago, or sorry, about 60 days ago in June. So this is our latest offering for server management capabilities. So if you're on the call today and you are somebody who says, you know what, I have a lot of equipment that's at the edge, meaning it's operating where the equipment is. Think of oil and gas, cell phone towers, or a lot of remote locations. Let's say you're in hospitality and you're struggling to manage all the servers that reside at every single one of your hotels. We now have what's called the Compute Cloud Console, which is a server management experience as a service. So you can utilize our as a service platform called HPE GreenLake, and you can log into our new cloud native application called the Compute Cloud Console, where you can onboard your servers, you can manage those servers, view the health and wellness, roll out firmware updates, all from the cloud. So now, when new features and exciting tools come out for the Compute Cloud Console, you don't have to update anything on your end. You can simply log in and the new features are there because it's a cloud native application. That was a very brief teaser. I don't want to go too far down that road because this is focused on supply chain security today, but just know that that's one of our latest server management tools. So very excited about the Compute Cloud Console. Any questions that you've had so far, you can simply email me at whipple@hpe.com. I think that email is about as simple as I could have gotten it. But with that, before we pivot over to James Morrison, I am going to open it up for some Q&A. I have not seen anything in the question and answer box. But are there any questions about some of the features that I've talked about so far?
One of the comments, there was a comment from Trevor, I think it was pretty much going along with what you were saying, Alan, about, with the increase of cybercrime, it appears that the most we can hope for is mitigation, forget prevention. But I mean, you are talking about ways in which you have looked into the supply chain itself and how you can really proactively go after some of the more common or normal ways that people will defeat a supply chain by installing a chip on hardware or messing with the firmware. Is that about right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I've failed to mention that I'll talk about is the vendors that we supply our components from have to follow a standards of business and ethics, conduct that we have in place for them. And we do routine checks at their facilities. So we want you to know when you're buying HPE servers, you're not having to worry about we're just getting the cheapest components everywhere we can. We have very strict security measures in place, even to the point where we go and we check to verify that they're following those measures. So we want you to have confidence that when you order just a normal server, we're very secure with the components we receive. And then if you want to ratchet it up, we can do the trusted supply chain where all those components are being verified by US HPE employees and making sure it's indeed authentic.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think that is all the questions that I'm saying. I'm just making sure I go through the Q&A. So we're all good. So I guess time to start doing some discussion with you and James.
You bet. So I'm excited to introduce James. I'll give you just a few minutes to officially introduce yourself, James.
So, yeah, my name is James Morrison. I'm a cybersecurity technologist with Hewlett Packard Enterprise. I joined HPE about 20 months ago after a 22-year career with the FBI, 8 years in the Air Force prior to that. And my goal and my role with HPE is to talk cybersecurity across all product lines and really have those security conversations with customers and say, where are you trying to go? What's the transformation? What's your challenges? And then help build that solution. So sometimes that solution, often we hope it's going to be HPE, but we're also building through partnerships. So we have partnerships with like AMD, and we have partnerships with CrowdStrike and Dragos and all of these other companies that provide this multi-layered security. Unfortunately, in the 20 months, we've seen a lot of transformation, and we're seeing the world really change around ransomware. And so ransomware and ransomware avoidance and ransomware mitigation has become really the conversation du jour because people are really worried about their data and how do I protect my data? How do I protect my data in all of its states? So while it's moving, while it's being used, while it's being stored, and those are the challenges that we've been seeing, come over from a lot of those conversations.
Thank you, James. Appreciate that. And James and I do a lot of presentations together, and we have great conversations. But I just want to start when we're talking about supply chain security. What does the cybersecurity landscape look like right now to you, James? You've seen it evolve so much throughout the years. What are we currently looking at?
Well, unfortunately, the attacks we've seen over the last, really year, when we look at SolarWinds and CompTIA in particular, the criminals, especially the nation states, are becoming very, proliferate and very good at their trade. So we have to recognize that software and hardware supply chain are being threatened. Because a lot of times we have vendors that are, doing services and building product outside of the United States. It adds to that risk and adds to that challenge. That's why the creation of the CMMC, for example, the Cyber Maturation Model certification for DOD was really driven. Was how do I show that the companies that are feeding me into my supply chain are following good cyber hygiene, and what level of cyber hygiene are they having? And so hardware has been a challenge. While I was in the FBI, we had cases where hard drives had pre-installed malicious code in the firmware of hard drives, especially if the contract was specifically spelled out for a government agency, for example. That's one of the reasons that we weren't allowed to buy from certain vendors, because those vendors may have been owned by a country that was not necessarily friendly to the United States, and so we had to, that was always a challenge. And so we worked closely with NSA to kind of watch our adversary, but also sometimes it's, for example, we had an alarm company that was sold to a French manufacturer, and there was a lot of conversation around whether we could continue to still use it just because it was now foreign owned. And those are challenges that are going to be continuing because it's an international economy, but in an international economy, every country still has its own sort of rules around what they're willing to do, and you know, whether it's espionage or corporate espionage or something along those lines.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And so let's have a little bit of fun here. And what is one of your most interesting security hacks you've seen, James?
Well, I mean, you know, we talk about the edge, and you hear a lot of conversations around security at the edge. And now our edge is people working from home, it's mobility, it's IoT. And so, you know, a few years back, there was a fairly interesting hack at a casino where a ransomware was actually dropped into a thermostat inside of a saltwater tank for persistence purposes. The reason is that as a criminal gets in your network, they have three goals. One is persistence, one is moving laterally, and one is gaining escalating privileges. So their ingenious idea was to drop their ransomware into this thermostat, and when they reloaded all their machines and it touched that thermostat again, it reinfected the network. We've seen that, and it took that casino a little while to figure out that what was happening. But we've also seen that being done, for example, in printers, where some printers have been used as a storage location for ransomware to reinfect a network. We've also seen that in routers and other devices like that. And there have been some indications, and this was kind of one of the conversations HPE's been having for some years, is they've been trying to drop it into firmware, trying to drop it into the BIOS, trying to drop it into a hard-coded place where we wouldn't think about having to reload it. So those are new challenges that are going to continue to arise.
I love that one. Well, I shouldn't say I love that cyber attack, right? But when you're dealing with a saltwater fish tank in a casino, that's practically impossible to detect. But I'm glad that they did. So I would say, you know, what has changed the most in the last 18 months? I know this answer, but will you share that with those who are on the call today? When you look at security and the threats that are out there, what has changed most? What is evolving?
Well, unfortunately, we sort of predicted this about 4 years ago, but we're seeing an industrialization of cybercrime. Cybercrime is now very, very organized because of things like the dark web and cryptocurrency. They are able to drive an economy of scale. And as you were saying before, the amount of money being driven around cybercrime is enormous. A good example of this is what we see with REvil or Revel, where they hit JBS, the meatpacking plant, and got an $11 million payout, and then immediately turned around and used that money to most likely purchase a 0-day to target CompTIA. And then they go after CompTIA and they ask for a $50 million payout. So these are how the ransomware organizations are becoming very organized, very driven in their attack surface. And so what we're also seeing, and this is based upon some information we see around Mandiant and sort of tangentially what we've seen, about 40% of cyber attacks now are not directly attributable to you. They're coming through supplies or services that you're getting from outside of you. So we've seen construction companies being hit. We've seen, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning companies hit, and companies that connect into your network, and then they can use that access to gain a foothold and launch a much more damaging attack. So we have to start, and that's why CMMC is going to become increasingly more important. You got to work with people that have a good cyber hygiene and that they've been validating their supply chain. You can't just buy anything off the shelf from anywhere in the world and just expect that there's going to be security built into it. That's not realistic. We got to start looking at where we're getting our product from and making sure that that product doesn't have a risk already built into it before it's ever even installed.
I like that a lot, James. And one thing that I talk a lot about is we have to make sure that we enable security features. A lot of times we might buy the right product or do the right thing, but we're not actually enabling the features that are there. So pivoting over to supply chain security, I know you've already highlighted a little bit. Why does that matter so much? I know that answer, but what are your thoughts on why it's so important today?
Well, I call it cyber nationalism. I mean, every country is going to do what they feel is important to their national interests. And so when we're developing hardware and software outside the United States, one aspect we have to worry about is how much has that network or how much has that supplier been infiltrated by agents not friendly to the United States? This is very common in both, we see it in Eastern Europe and we see it in Southeast Asia, where China and Russia have gained access into networks that are in those areas. So we have to recognize that that creates vulnerability. That's a vulnerability that can be exposed. Even outside of national, though, we've seen, for example, chip shortages recently, coming out of Taiwan because of a drought in Taiwan. And so what we're going to start seeing, and I think we've seen a couple of executive orders recently around this, is there's an attempt to start trying to pull back some of that manufacturing to the United States in order to protect our own needs and our own national interests. And that's why we've been working, for example, with like Intel, and Intel is now building a new plant, a new fab plant in Arizona to start bringing back some of that manufacturing in order, and that's where it's going to work with our trusted supply chain offering.
No, that's great to know. So with that, I would ask, is Made in the USA really that important today, right? This whole pivot to, like you mentioned, Intel coming over, building a plant in Arizona. Is it really that important, the Made in the USA storyline and messaging?
I think in the security world, it absolutely is. Again, working with NSA and with my time in the FBI, I mean, we only wanted to purchase things that were made in the USA. That was a big focus for us from a classification standpoint. But what we've realized over some of the government breaches we've had in the last 5 to 7 years, it's not all about security. It's not about classification. The breach of OPM, the breach of some of the GSA type breaches, that exposes data about U.S. citizens and especially people in the intelligence community or in the military that could be used against them. And we've always been concerned around China, for example, creating dossiers on U.S. citizens that they might then turn around and use against them. Why would a hack against a credit agency be important to the Chinese government? Because now I can use that information to say, oh, this person's having trouble with their credit, and they may become somebody that's exploitable. So Made in the USA is important. It is of value. And it's, we have to know that, and one of the things we talk about at HPE is I need to know that the core of my hardware is secure. And if I don't know that my server itself is secure, how am I going to build a security model over the top? That's a challenge. So that's why we focus at hardware level security, and we've been building security up from that level.
That's a great answer, and I love that. We always talk about, and you hear me train all the time, we got to get past this false sense of security of I've got a great firewall, and I still feel a fear that a lot of customers are in that realm of, we're protecting against anything that's coming in from the outside when you don't even know if maybe you tried to save a few dollars buying an SSD off of eBay or Amazon. You could have that malware already in it. So you've shared a couple examples. Do you have any other specific examples around supply chain security compromises that you've seen throughout the years?
There was a big one a couple of years ago, and it's been disputed. And this was the Bloomberg article around the big hack.
Yep.
Where there was a report that hit Bloomberg saying that there were some servers that had an additional chip installed on their board. And then when the boards arrived, it allowed someone, we'll say someone in Asia most likely, to access all of the data on that server. When the actual investigation went out, no one was willing to validate that these servers had actually been received. And so the FBI did an investigation. We weren't able to find it, and Bloomberg wasn't going to reveal their sources. But we did prove that it was possible in a laboratory environment. And so that at very least starts to challenge that conversation of, if my servers are actually being manufactured outside the United States, do I know that they're secure? I know of another case where some NIC cards they were built in the Far East, had been installed in servers, and those NIC cards had a pre-installed remote access tool that reported back to IP addresses that mapped back into some Chinese threat actors. So that's going to be a challenge. That's going to be a world that we live in, that we if we are buying technology that's being developed or produced in countries that are, at the very least, not have their own national interest in mind, it does at least create a risk and a vulnerability. That is a minimum. I can for sure say.
Yeah, so with that, what are some of the critical features or functionalities you would recommend then when we're looking at supply chain security? What are some things that you absolutely not only have to consider, but to essentially install or have in your machines?
Well, I mean, we really want, as much as possible, we want made in the USA. I mean, that's going to be a conversation, right? We want to make sure of that. The other thing is that in security overall, and this is something you and I have talked about, is speed of recovery. You know, if let's say, for example, I buy a server, you know, and whoever that server is, and I insert a network card into that server, and then I find out that that network card is malicious, so it's doing something unusual. How am I going to recover that server to at least its baseline? Right now, the process could be somewhat long and arduous, where we have to go back to the software that we had when the server was created, and then recreate that. That can take a while. With our rapid restore, rapid recovery, we can restore you to a baseline very quickly, and do it in a way that we can validate that it is the exact same configuration as to what you had. Hardware attacks are increasing, so what we're also trying to do is we're pushing security up the stack, and what we now do through a thing called Project Aurora is if you allow HPE to manage your cloud environment through GreenLake Managed Services, we will also make sure that nothing in the operating system, no virtual machines, no containers have been modified. And if that happens, we can automatically recover those to the last known good. So that's the world we live in. I think the question earlier was, can we avoid ransomware? Probably not. Can we mitigate ransomware? Absolutely. Yep. And we have to be able to recover faster. Days of downtime is not going to work in today's world. You know, I call it the Amazon, you know, paradox. If I go to a website to buy a product and that website's down, I'm going somewhere else and I'll never come back. So we've got to make sure that we maintain, you know, availability. That we've got to make, you know, and we got to make sure that, you know, you're able to recover as fast as possible so that you don't lose visibility to your customers.
So that leads me to this question where I'm going to look into my crystal ball and I'm going to ask you, where will cybersecurity be in the next, you know, 12 to 24 months? What do you see being the next big focus?
We're seeing a big push towards consolidation of at least visibility on security products. Every company has 12 to 24 security products inside their network. The problem is that right now they are treated as 12 to 24 disparate pieces of information. So what we're looking at is centralization, and so we do that through Aruba ClearPass or Aruba Central. Also looking at data analytics. If my data analytics for my storage are in a different place than the data analytics for my server, which is in a different location than the data analytics for my network devices, that means I have to look at 3 separate places to make sure that my stuff is being patched. That isn't working in today's world. We want one centralized location. We do it through InfoSight. We want to make sure that, you know, for example, patching. Patching is one of the most basic security postures that we have to be in, but we have so many things to patch that often we just lose track of what's important. So we want to prioritize patching. We want to make sure that we're patching what's critically important. Things like, you know, our Microsoft Exchange server, and maybe we're not as worried about, you know, a network card, you know, an obscure network card. So centralization of data, more data analytics, more behavioral analytics and security. That's why we built this relationship with CrowdStrike and Fortinet, and making sure that we have their visibility built in and baked into our software and to our security. Because we have to move faster, and we can't expect our IT staffs to move faster. We have to automate some of that. So AI and machine learning is going to be the future, but it's going to be in a very limited environment. So we have to teach our environments to do the right thing based upon policy and procedures we built.
No, I like that a lot, and I know you talked about Project Aurora, and that's kind of a zero trust model from HPE, but how does that help customers specifically with supply chain security, this new Project Aurora from HPE?
Yeah, and you touched on zero trust, and I'll come back to that a little bit. But Project Aurora is built upon our servers. So it is built upon the HPE Gen 10, Gen 10 Plus servers, and they are built in the United States. So that can be part of that offering, is that we can say that this is a made in America GreenLake managed services with the Project Aurora over the top. So now we can validate the entire process that says from cradle to grave, we know exactly where that server came from. We know exactly the operating system that was loaded on it through the security products that we offer. I can tell you exactly who touched it because I have those people, cleared inside of my plant. So it's almost like evidence. And so in evidence, you have this chain of custody. We need to have that same expectation when we're buying a security device or a IT device that is critical to our infrastructure. And so especially in the federal government, that's going to be increasingly important. And I think, President Biden put out his executive order in May, which has had, I think it's a 120-day study about security in the federal sector. We're coming up on that. September, we're going to start to see that deadline hit. And every federal agency is going to have to come back and say, how are we going to secure our network better? How are we going to do it? And I think one of those conversations has to be, I got to trust my supply chain. I have to trust that where I'm buying things from is legitimate and it has not been tampered with.
I like that. So I know we've had some great conversation. I could talk with James for hours on this, but I'll leave with one final question that I have. So for those on the call today, if you're a business, what should you do today to start addressing security concerns? Let's say you're overwhelmed with so much. Where do I start? What's most important, right?
Yeah, we have to start putting security at the top. Security has to be the conversation that begins where we go, and it has to be a culture. Every company, I don't care your size, is a target for modern cybercrime, and you're going to hear a lot of buzz around zero trust. All zero trust is a thought. It's a thought process towards security. It's not any particular technology. It's that I have to look at everything I do and validate. And as we've said, trust, but verify. So it's not about not trusting our employees. It's just recognizing that our employees are trying to do the business they want to do. And in doing that, they might be exposed. And we want to validate that their credentials are not being used in a malicious way. So the zero trust fabric is going to push forward. You're going to hear a lot more buzz around it. And I think we're going to see more of a solidification on what it really means. And there's a zero trust working group right now that's working towards that end.
Thank you. That's great feedback. And thank you, James, for taking the time to just chat with me on how important security is. James is very well versed, as you can tell. I do see a couple questions here that I'm going to jump into on the Q&A box. And one of those was around the supply chain or the chip shortage that we're seeing globally. HP is navigating that to the best of their abilities. They feel a little bit of impact, but they do a really good job at forecasting, right, and getting ahead of these things as they do happen. So the good news is, yes, we do have servers available. So don't be concerned when it says if I reach out to HP, do you have product? We do have the product. And James, if any of these feel like you can answer as well, that's great. We have one that says, what has the priority in being secured, the network infrastructure or the endpoint devices? What would you say, James?
We're seeing the conversation driven more towards security at the edge right now. People are concerned about the edge. The edge now includes remote workforce. And so the traditional infrastructure that we built is probably outdated. In the old days when I was in the Air Force and I was building networks, that were lateral, right, or vertical, we had a firewall and 98% of our data exited through that firewall. That's not today's world. Today's world, we're producing 70 to 80% of our data at the edge of our networks. And we're trying to figure out how do we secure that data from the edge into the cloud? How do we secure that data into our data centers? And so because the edge is IoT and OT and mobility and all of these things, the edge is the biggest concern people have. And that's why we've been focused on the edge, and through our acquisition of Silver Peak, looking at, how do we secure that SD-WAN type environment? At our relationships with Fortinet, how do we help with, and CrowdStrike with edge security and edge devices? I think the edge is the challenge right now.
Awesome. Thank you. Another couple questions, and this one I can take. Speaking of patching, is the HP customer responsible for keeping the HP servers patched, or does HP manage this? That's $1 million question, right? But we know that the majority of our customers, once they get that equipment, that lies on their shoulders, right? If there are critical updates, HP will absolutely roll those out. But I did talk about the Compute Cloud Console that not too long ago, and that new offering in the cloud. The cool part about that tool is it will constantly use AI and automation to evaluate what firmware pieces need to be patched or what hot fixes are available. So that is one of our newest solutions to address one of those issues directly. So that's a good one there. James, this one might be more for you. Will the Department of Defense CMCC certification program extend and apply to non-USA suppliers?
The belief is yes, eventually it will. The way it works is, like right now, there are certain contracts. In order to bid on them, you have to have a certain level of CMMC certification. So that's what's going to end up happening over time. So there will be some non-US suppliers that have level 1, CMMC, maybe level 2. And so if the contract allows a level 1 or level 2 provider to bid on it, then yes, they will be able to, and they will be, it can be extended. But if it's 3, 4, 5, the odds are most of the 3, 4, and 5s will be US based companies who have gone through some extensive validation for that. So CMMC is really the teeth of FedRAMP. So FedRAMP, I claim that I am at X level. CMMC says, show me, prove it. And that's the challenge, is you have to actually prove it and get validated and certified that you are a level 3 provider. And that's what's probably over the next few years. How are we going to do that is the question that the DOD's been asking.
Thanks, James. And I will answer this last question, and then we'll pivot to our next set of presenters here. So now I can't feel secure with the purchase of my SSD on Amazon that is free of malware. So I would often say, just with anything in Amazon, eBay, know your buyers, know the risk that you're assuming in doing that. We do, HPE, have a presence on Amazon, so you always have to pay attention. And you know what? That's a great example of cyber attackers. Some people try to look like HPE on Amazon as well. So click into the buyer profile, and you'll find out if it's indeed us or not. But I always just say be cautious, right? I know it's tempting to go get the cheaper versions. The part numbers match up, but you still just never know, because our counterfeiters are so good at copying our labels that go actually on our memory and on our SSDs. But with that, we are right at our time, 2 minutes early, but we hope you've enjoyed learning a lot from James and learning about HPE security strategy. It is absolutely #1 to us, and we are very much taking the supply chain security message very seriously. So thank you. We'll hand it off now.
Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you, James. Thank you, Alan, for your discussion about supply chain security. Folks, our next visitors to the mini boot camp from GDIT, we have Ken Vitt. Ken, how you doing, Ken?
Doing good. Can you hear me okay, James?
Can hear you okay. Now, folks, you're going to hear a bit of an echo from Ken and the folks that he's brought in, the colonels that he's brought in. But I'm very excited to hear about what your perspectives are about supply chain security and all things security. So, Ken, I'll turn the time over to you for the next hour. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, James. So we're down here at AFCEA TechNet in Augusta, and I have the pleasure of sitting here with a group of service members, as you can see from the slide there. We are all combat veterans. I'm a retired signal officer myself, and I have the distinct pleasure of not only calling these guys former workmates, but also friends. So I'll go ahead and let each one of them introduce themselves. We'll start with Colonel Mike Packard here.
Good afternoon, Colonel Mike Packard, recently retired. In fact, you're all in retirement roles at the end of this month. So just coming out of a stint in the Joint Staff J36, working National Nuclear Command and Control and communications there. Previously spent time at DISA, running a field office supporting AFRICOM, as well as several stints within the Army, managing networks from all the way from the 5th RCC up to the 2nd RCC, as well as standing up a JNCC, Afghanistan at Bagram Air Base. So that's pretty much my background as an FA-24, FA-26. Spent a lot of time managing networks as well as resourcing networks and resourcing JRSS in the past and resourcing getting the network upgraded within the past while I was at the Army G6. So pleasure to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
I'm Neil Katad. I am in charge of Defensive Cyberspace Operations, Enterprise Department of Defense Information Network Services, cybersecurity and inspection program called CCRI for the Army. In my current job for about 1.4 million endpoints on 5 continents. My previous job, I was brigade commander in Europe for the 2nd Sentinel Brigade. We had all of the Army's networks from tactical up through strategic for Europe and parts of Africa at times. I've got 27 years in the Army, which makes me a little bit younger than the guy to my right. It's used my squad leader at West Point, and I've known him a long time. And so I can give you those types of perspectives from a life of 27 years as a signal officer.
Carl. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carl Young, a retiring colonel as well. I'm looking at Mike's picture on the website there. And Mike, something happened to you in the last couple of years because you look young and bigger. But anyway, I'm a National Guard officer. I'm the youngest of this team now, and just retired as well. Coming out of the job as the Chief of Staff for our Army National Guard Affairs at the Cyber Center of Excellence. My previous position was the Enterprise Architect for the Army and Chief Data Strategist for the Army, working for General Crawford at the Headquarters Department of the Army COG6 office. Prior to that, I've also served with Joint Staff and War Plans, working IT solutions for our war planning environment, and then before that, Enterprise Architect and Policy Chief for the Army National Guard. So also I'm a 53, now 26, which is an Information Systems Engineer officer, and recently was accepted into the Cyber Corps, though I have not put on the gray.
So today what we're going to talk about is DODIN operations and the changing environment, or the new environment. And to relate this to the secure supply chain, there's really essentially 2 networks that the Army operates on. What we call the business network, or NIPR, and then what we call the tactical network, or the SIPR network, which is really our operational network. But as you deploy from a home station into the battle space, you have the whole logistics supply chain that goes along with it, the operational piece to that. And so many of the things that you've heard in the previous discussion are things we're going to touch on a little bit, but how do we make sure, first of all, that the data is secure, the network is secure, and that people have access to that data. And the team that I've had here, I've established here today, we've all had experience in operating, maintaining, and securing those networks, whether it's NIPR or SIPR or the business network or the tactical. And we've come over years, and this is where, from our very younger years as lieutenants, operating the business network or the NIPR side, we've all seen different types of security things, and we've heard these we've heard discussions about this today and the past few days here at AFCEA. Discuss some of the things that have been mentioned here, like the JRSS. Today we got to listen to General Yee talk about Thunderdome, and that these are going to change the way these new technologies and ideas are going to change the way we do operations in the future. And then we're going to kind of walk you back through how we got to where we were, and possibly, show you the way we're going. So the first thing I want to bring up is where we came from. When I first came into the Army, we had NECs all over the place. Carl and I were both Guard officers, and we got the privilege to operate and help maintain GuardNet. And we had the 54 states and territories. We had 7 gateways and a distributed network. And so we've got to see how that's changed over the years. So the first thing I want to talk about, because I know when I first got introduced to Mike here, he was the TNOPS director at Conix. And we didn't have JRSS back then. We had single TLA stacks and a lot of different systems. So Mike, can you talk a little bit about what it was like back then running and operating the CONUS
Well,
TNOS.
and it may be worth sharing with the civilian members of the group kind of what the JRS Interpretation Committee looks like.
We'll get to that. I think, yeah, go ahead, Mike.
So to kind of to build on what both Ken and Carl had said, starting in, and I like to go back to when I was the operations officer at the Europe TNOS, and really Europe at that time was what we called Fortress Europe. So it was essentially a large, from a viewpoint of the network, a large base. It had a couple of TLAs, top layer architectures, security architectures, and everything. If it left Europe, fed in and out of those security stacks. Now, within the TNOS itself, we were, even though we were co-located in the same building, we were still kind of disconnected from the RSERT that was in the same building. So we're on different floors, so we didn't really operate all that well together. And I just say that because it feeds into a larger point of being disconnected regionally between Europe and CONUS, and disconnected logically from the security aspect and the network operations aspect. To explain that a little bit further, when I went over to CONUS, every single base had its own TLA stack that was managed centrally from the TNOS, but everything below that TLA was managed by the NEC. So services that were on the base managed by the NEC, but anything that happened with the TLA had to come back to the TNOS. Prior to me getting there, that included email services. So all the email servers, all those email servers were down at the base level, and then we had some email routing services within the TLA stack to help all that. So really, from that perspective, trying to manage and operate the DODIN at that time, we didn't call it as such, we called it more network operations or NetOps. You were very disconnected from base to base. And you had to, and that was the time when we were experiencing, if you left Fort Carson, your email went from carson.army.mil to lewis.army.mil. And the guard, all due respect to the guard, and Ken taught me a lot when I was on the G6, when we were on the G6 staff together. That was disconnected from the regular Army network as well, for a lot of different reasons, different mission sets and different things that had to go on, and different security contexts that would happen. So that really fed into a sense of we had to work very hard in order to make sure that we were trying to work together from a security aspect and from a network operations aspect. We did that better in the CONUS TNOS because we put the RSERT personnel, especially the shift personnel, directly on the floor with the TNOS personnel. So that, then you got the crosstalk, and you got the good working relationship that way. And from my perspective, that's where I really saw the value of having a SOC and a NOC together. Put it in those terms. That was absolutely essential. And because we were disconnected as well, we were all using different tools. We had all tuned those tools to different ways of doing it. We had used different data structures in those tools. We had used different naming conventions, and there was no way to bring that all up to a centralized headquarters so that headquarters could make sense of it and see what to do from a strategic perspective. And so that just made it that much more difficult. So if we had not made the steps that we had made in all of our histories, really don't know how Neil would be able to do his.
Just operating those networks was the miracle of loaves and fish.
Right.
Trying to hunt for an adversary line, impossible.
Impossible. Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have made a lot of steps along the way, and we have made those strides. We've still got a ways to go, but that's a little bit of the history of what we've done.
You're making me feel old. I just realized I am the oldest member of the panel because I stood up the first email exchange server in Europe. I was over there as a second lieutenant, first lieutenant. And I stood up in 1998, 97, an exchange server, and the naming convention was First Armored Division Artillery, .mil.
Right.
And so we used to have email servers all the way down to the brigades, and then so this is the progression of the consolidation. We've seen email, system services, and also security. We didn't even have firewalls on our networks at the time. And throughout the years, we've evolved with technology. And I know when we get over to Carl, we're going to talk about how those policies and that have changed over the years. And oftentimes you'll see the policy is always behind the technology. And that's something that, we have all had to operate and work with and through. So,
to that point, as you saw it, and we all saw it, as we did centralize email services into this enterprise, defense enterprise email, we saw not only the policy had to catch up, but our way of operating the network had to catch up. And our way of reacting to incidents on the network had to catch up. Because, and I'm a DISA alum, so, I'm not bashing DISA, I'm just saying what happened at the time. DISA was not prepared to deal with Tier 1 incidents. They depended on the Army to do that. And if we couldn't fix it, then we had to go to as Tier 2 individuals, had to go to our Tier 3, which was DISA. And that's how we interacted. I do believe that at some point that paradigm may have to change.
And so, Mike and I can talk about how things operated in the past. And like I said, we didn't even have firewalls on our networks to begin with. And then, as Mike talked about, we had the first TLA stacks deployed, and they had a basic level firewall and an IPS, and then we started adding new capabilities based on the evolving technologies that came about. And that's what led us into what we now call the JRSS, the Joint Regional Security Stacks, which General Yee talked about earlier today on the panel he was at. And then we have Neil, who's now taken over, but when he was at 2nd Signal Brigade, I'm sure you saw that, because you saw how some of the new technologies were being put into place.
It's really interesting where we came from. You truly couldn't capture the cost of what your network was, right? Because I ran a server on ID.army.mil, and then everybody went and bought their own endpoints, and you configured them a different way, and there was no ability to really understand what you have out there. What was the true cost? And I think email is a good example of that. If I had to amortize how much per mailbox we were paying for that little server, I ran in the basement of an old World War II era building, the cost was astronomical when you try to amortize that across the Army. What was really interesting is when you go to those joint TLA stacks that eventually became JRSS, and then you go to the centralized email system, you can actually figure out what it costs per system, right? That was huge. That gets you thinking that these things a little differently. And so that drives a whole lot of other stuff. So as we flatten these networks, one of the things I found in brigade commands, I couldn't see my entire network. Although I knew what was out there from buying it, and having it essentially sort of procured, I could not see end-to-end the entire enterprise network that was servicing our network enterprise centers, our bases, our camps, and our stations. On the same pane of glass, I could see my tactical formations of connecting out into, going into Poland or going into Romania. So we really did some experimentation to try to see ourselves, because that's one of the zero trust principles. If you've got to be able to see everything, you've got to be able to configure everything and understand what ports, protocols, and services open or close and where you're vulnerable on software. So those were some of the interesting things that you had to iterate to get there. And so I think that now the Army is looking at not only that, but how do you centralize endpoint discovery and reporting? the Army's got that as a service. It's called Army Information Security Solution, and it's working pretty well. We tried to do it in these little pockets with HPSS, and it was a disaster. Some were good, some were bad, but now we've made that a managed service to procure. And we're putting that in the entire Army, 1.4 million endpoints. And I'll tell you the difference when you have a thing like SolarWinds, where it's affecting the entire world. When you can query your entire network and you can see it, and you can get that back in minutes rather than having to pick up the phone, call my friends at the National Guard who didn't have it. It took us 2 weeks to figure that out.
And that was fast.
Even though they worked hard. I mean, I don't fault them for it. But you can then take action a lot faster. And that's kind of where we have to be with some of these, decentralize what your needs are for your commander, centralize the security and the operation and the procurement of these types of capabilities. That's what I was seeing in the last job and in this job as well.
And one of the things I know, Mike and I both worked on the JRSS together. We were both budget officers. It's funny that the operations guys talking about the money and the cost of these things, not the budget officers. But the JRSS also brought a standardized tool set, which gave you that visibility. Now, unfortunately, it was only done on the business network or the NIPR network, which is, again, I'll go back to the supply chain. That is the one that helps enable the supply chain and is the business network for the Army. The G1, the G4 operate on primarily. And then Colonel Young, when he was at Army G6, you were doing the architecture for much of this. And so what we're living with now, we're beginning to see, is probably some of the architecture you're developing.
Yes, there's a couple
of data.
Well, there's a couple of things that we've already hit on. I think are worth kind of capturing for just a moment. Everywhere that we as the Army would try, and I mean the whole Army, all three components of it, would try to consolidate its capabilities. You have this tug of war, this natural human instinct to either hug my servers in the older days, less so today, but more, I don't want you to mess with my stuff, and I don't trust you to do your part. And so as capabilities increase, and as conveniences increase, we have to be very mindful of the security impacts of those capabilities and conveniences, to include consolidation, as well, and then the budget impacts. Neil pointed it out perfectly. If you can't see it, it's really hard to count it. There's, for everything that Mike was doing with the Army, the National Guard had to do the same thing with 54 little kingdoms known as the states and territories that comprise the National Guard. In fact, Second Lieutenant Young in 1997 ran 151SIGBN.Army.mil, South Carolina National Guard, and was quickly thrown off the net once I turned it on. But so as we consolidate these resources, the question becomes, how are we consolidating? To what standard or model is the consolidation coming? Well, Dob like just 2-3 years ago, JRSS was being fielded really at brute force, and because it had to be done that way, because this trust factor didn't really exist. And I remember General Baker, the commander in that comment at the time, JRSS was having some design challenges, and some things weren't working. We'll just say shortly. Things weren't working very well. Well, as the enterprise architect for the Army, I remember receiving a call one Sunday afternoon from General Baker's chief of staff, "Hey, Young," and I'll paraphrase for the kind Christians on the line, "what's going on and when are you fixing it?" And that's when I had to have a very frank conversation with senior leadership of the Army. General Crawford, my boss at the Pentagon, as well as General Baker down at NetCom, "Sir, you don't have an architecture for this. What you have is a network design that the PEO and DISO work together to develop in terms of a hardware solution. But what we had not done from a policy and architectural planning perspective is laid forth how we were going to integrate this stuff across something as large as the entire Army." Neil, you said how many endpoints?
1.4 million.
Today, you can identify 1.4 million. And let's assume that number was higher before I could begin to identify them. And in the National Guard, I know that we have approximately 2,800 locations just in the Guard. So I don't know exactly how many endpoints we have in those locations across the various time zones that we have to deal with. And so the challenge then is, how do you start with security in mind? How do you start with your budget in mind, your capability in mind, simultaneously as you build the plan to go forward to minimize disruptions, minimize the cataclysmic challenges that come when things like JRSS go sideways. It's got to be done, but there are things that we continue to learn and improve on how we do it.
One of the things we'll move in a little bit further, but we've now just talked a little bit about the technology and the architecture, but this has also affected the budgets and also the people. When we had the multiple NECs and the 54 states and territories with the email service and that, as the technology is consolidated, like Defense Enterprise Email and then the JRSS, the people that were out there in the brigades and the post-camp stations and the 54 states and territories, they don't have email servers to manage it. They no longer have security stacks to manage. So that's allowed us to, one, have more efficiencies both within the budget, but also with the consolidation of operations. So Mike and I worked at the Pentagon together, and then shortly after that, he went down to DISA Africa. And while you were at DISA Africa, that's when DISA Global evolved. And so what kind of changes did you see when you were there at DISA Global? And I think, Neil, where were you about that time? Were you up in Europe then, or?
I was up in Southeast Asia.
Okay.
You came later.
Yeah. So Mike, tell us about how you saw the consolidation of operations with DISA Global while you were in DISA.
So spent a lot of time every day on the stand-up at DISA Global, and what you had was still a focus from a DISA perspective on the broader, the big networks, the big pipes, the big things that they were doing. Now, caught up in that was also some element of being able to do some cybersecurity actions that had to be done, such as whitelisting different websites, making sure that they were still operational, and that I remember I wasn't directly involved in it, but I remember that was a huge topic of conversation, and took several weeks on end before we were able to actually get something out that had the force of an order to say, if you do not whitelist your website, it's going to be blocked. And some people didn't believe us, and their websites got blocked, and then we had to work through another couple of weeks of getting all of that. So that coordination was the biggest thing that changed, as well as having the force of an order to be able to do it. It wasn't really until JFHQ, JFHQ DODIN, the operational side of DISA, came into it that they were really able to start working those things in for lack of a better term, in a military manner. Putting things out in an order that people could take action on in order to improve the network. But again, that was somebody sitting down, writing an order, getting it stamped by, at that time, Colonel Paul Craft, and then getting it sent out, distributed to everybody who could then have time to read it and figure out what they need to do and then take action on it. All the while, somebody could be sitting on our network doing whatever. So that was the biggest change that I see. Now it did improve over time, and the processes got better, but it was still a manual, paper-driven process. But in the end, it still had oversight at the SES and at the 3-star level from the DISA director to ensure that those actions were being taken.
Colonel Katas, so you're at our cyber now, and the Army still operates with essentially 5 RCCs. You got SWA, Europe, CONUS, PAC, and then we'll say Korea for the most part. So how do you see that? Because you're still essentially doing, I wouldn't say decentralized operations, but regional operations. Right. And so how do you maintain standardization across those regional cyber centers?
That's a good question. So they're all different. If you've seen one RCC, you've seen one RCC. You've seen 5 RCC, you've seen 5 different ones. I think what Mike did with the work that DISA did was absolutely essential in our ability to detect and see things. if everybody's got their own different whitelist program and policy, you've got so many different things to check to try to close any gaps, and that's just not doable. So that's a really good model. Some things need to be centralized. So when you look at the two functions of a regional cyber center, you have people who want to keep the network up and keep high availability. That's probably okay regionally because you're dealing with different regional partners, different commercial internet service providers you have to work with for your link, whether it's British Telecom, Korean Telecom. Those relationships are very, very important locally to understand what the norm is. You kind of know which circuit's going to go down because the backhoe is going to get it. I can still remember the one at CENTCOM that we downloaded every other week, and that was painful. But when you look at the defensive things and you look at the security posture of things, that's where you really got to start consolidating. So I think rather than looking at do we need 5 RCCs, maybe yes or no, and there's an answer in there somewhere, probably not. Maybe we do it with less. But there's utility in some sort of cyber center working with those local partners. What I don't think there's utility in is defending 5 different ways. So setting out common standards of where you're going to defend, what tasks you do, what's the risk associated, based on a common set of rule sets that we think that if I'm in Romania connecting to a Wi-Fi puck out of a hotel, that's probably a different risk category than if I'm sitting in Fort Hood, Texas. So figuring out what those rule sets are essentially and having them applied to the battle space that makes sense in those regions is probably a good way to do it. There's some, I know it might not have answered the question per se, but there's some policy and procedure and techniques that need to be centralized, and then decentralized execution based on the Army service component of commander's mission set. Probably okay, a little bit of centralized oversight. I think that's probably the way.
Well, and I'm going to piggyback right on it because everything he said applies to the National Guard, and I would say even certainly the reserves as well because of our part-time force, right? So we have, at one point, I think we had 7 or more regional nodes. Those are really nothing more than gateways for network traffic. They weren't really security nodes. And they consolidated down to 4, and really we're down to like 2.5 now. And so it's, we have resiliency balanced in to that more than one number. But what we've done is, to Neil's point, we have standardized what happens at that top layer and beginning to push those standards down lower as we're drawing services north, into the higher level. You can stabilize and create standard levels of service, standard levels of capabilities, standard levels of security. Now, what we have to balance, to Neil's other point, whether you're working in a hotel off of a Wi-Fi puck in Romania, that same model applies to, am I working in a hotel or an armory or a schoolhouse in South Dakota or Northern Virginia or where, pick a spot in the United States, Guam. And so how can I conduct the high availability network operations that I need to for whatever reason? Again, National Guard's got this fit support of civilian authorities. I've always looked at our civilian partners as coalition members from a network perspective. So a coalition net, I'm not going to let certain partners on the network reciprocal no more than I will let the fire chief, right? But I still have to provide some services to ensure we can safely and securely conduct business and support our mission set. Same as supporting a Romanian partner or a Polish partner, I would think.
I'm sure what the Guard's done really, really well when you talk about the consolidation is, when you've got thousands and thousands of armories, you're never going to get the talent on the workforce to do this.
And that's the other thing. You've got to look at that.
You've got to consolidate those tasks and really invest in the people. You've got to deal with that.
Right.
And the Guard is the perfect example. I think the more we standardize, the better we can get that cost-benefit analysis.
Yep.
And the Army had to make a hard decision not long ago when it was tool consolidation time. We had 2 tools that almost did the same. And we saved probably $16, $17 million by eliminating that duplicate effort. And you have to ask yourself, was I getting $17 million of added capability? And we had to answer, the answer ended up being no. Was it perfect? No, I got about 95% utility of having both tools. We save $17 million, which then we can take and do things like hire the workforce that you need for those complex tasks and train them better. Then you get a composite better level of security. I think that's a way to move forward.
Well, and I think for all components of the Army, you hit on probably Carl's opinion, the critical security risk of all of our networks, it is our workforce, our humans, both the users and those folks who keep the thing running. You know, the further we have it distributed, the greater the challenge is to ensure the baseline understanding and training and education. And then there's also the resources applied to ensuring that the users of the systems understand what they're doing, understand how they can really cause us harm. You know, because we're going to spend the efforts to detect those users who are acting maliciously. But to me, it's the accidental and not the nefarious that cause as much harm as anything.
One of the other things that we've kind of touched on, but we haven't really dived into yet is, you know, we talk about the new tools and these consolidation of systems. One of the other things that's allowed us to do is also collect operational data from our network. So as we get to, again, what I say, a more data-centric operational construct, you know, how are we leveraging the data that we're collecting from the operational side to operate, maintain, and secure those networks from a defensive cyber operations perspective?
I think that's more of an answer for Neil.
Yeah.
I'm just an old, you know, I'm going to deliver you a network service type. So
I'll do my best to answer that. I'll unpack it a couple ways. I'll use a story. We had to clear the network for SolarWinds. No different than anybody else in the whole world. Some people outsourced it, some people had their own workforce. What we know is that to clear a network and really know your network, you've got to have host data, what's on those files, where, and then you have to compile that and compare and contrast against the network flow data. And so when you have to try to go get it in real time, it's very, very hard. So collecting data from on-premises in those two areas is essential. And getting that into the big data platform so you can mine through that, mostly the logs. And so if you think about it, 1.4 million inputs, when we look at log data that we have to try to collect for that, you're looking in the billions. And so when you correlate billions of logs, it's just an impossibility for human eyes. So the getting the machines to learn what's anomalous, getting the machines to learn what's anomalous but not really that interesting. So we developed we have 8 right now for the cloud. We have about 25 for on-premises use cases that we think are interesting. I'll unpack one of them for you. So we just stood up an enterprise cloud security office because in SolarWinds we found the real danger was not the SolarWinds itself. We could contain that, figured out what it was, get them off the network. In industry, our partners, and one of the big eye-openers was we are no different than industry. Matter of fact, they're a lot better. Many companies are a lot better than the U.S. Army at figuring this stuff out in incident response. They do it more often because they didn't invest in JRSS and that big moat and castle that was behind. So the adversary pivoted, popped a SAML token on a local active AD server, and then pivoted into the cloud. And from there, they went everywhere. 50% of some of the companies that had to hire outsource cleanup never had SolarWinds. They had Sunburst malware. And so we're like, holy smokes, we've got to figure this out in the cloud because we are just assuming cloud is secure. You know, CSSP is doing it. That's not the case. So you've got to really get into the data tools inside the cloud, figure out what you need to extrapolate so you can do the cross-referencing of the data, what's in cloud versus on-premises. Now you're talking about, you know, more than a couple billion logs a day. And so that's absolutely essential to go fast. As we move forward, we talked about JRSS, and that's in the terminology of Zero Trust, we're talking about that's a moat and castle defense. Everything inside the moat we trust. Everything outside gets a hard inspection. I think we've seen that assumption be challenged by adversaries getting better at attacking. And so Zero Trust will go one order of magnitude bigger than that for daily logs you have to go through, because everything gets a log, everything gets verified, everything gets identity checked on it, whether it's the machine or the persona. And so the only way to do that is get that what's key, and then either distributed elastic type of computing, or get it to a big data platform, or a combination of hybrid of both to figure out what you're looking at. And that's how you get, I think, more proactive in defending these networks, because it changes and shifts. And just patching vulnerabilities, although that's good, and we aren't that great at it, from time to time where you are. It's only the known bads. Some of those adversaries don't even use other malwares. They're just getting in because they're good. So I think that's where we have to be.
I don't know, this next question might be better for Carl, but I know when I was at NetCom, we had, and also Guardrail, we had this thing called the cyber scorecard. I've seen the cyber scorecard change a little bit over the years. It hasn't changed much. And you were doing some of the policy stuff there, I believe. I'm trying to think how, or I don't know if you got involved in the CCR or the CCI cyber inspection.
So more in the evolution of RMF and moving to continuous monitoring. And so I wasn't involved in its final variance execution, but the intent is pretty clear. Is that whatever your network is operating on, you're continuously looking into your risk, you're continuously evaluating your environment. And that depends on two things I think that Neil's talking about. And I'll turn it back over to you, Neil, for extra. One, you've got to have a common operation picture. You've got to know what you're looking at, know what your environment has, know what's valuable. I think you have to prioritize the value within what you see, because you're going to triage certain things otherwise. And the second piece is you've got to be collecting the necessary data with the tools like their platform to give you some intelligence to let you know what's anomalous, what is actually a threat or risk, or what's an inconvenience. Neil, am I way off base?
So you're dead on. There's a couple things in RMF that the Army's making a change, DOD's making a change. It was a beautiful thought of RMF. It really was. A lot of people thought hard about it, and it really worked hard on it. I don't mean to criticize, but 1,800 control measures that you must continuously monitor.
Can't keep up with it.
I can barely manage 5 things, you know, and some people say that's just because of the officer. But if you're looking at 1,800 things simultaneously, you're looking at them. So right now we're working through how do I get those control measures down to something meaningful, and how do I multi-echelon look at this? What are the things that machines can look for me, and I just don't have to worry about, versus those things that I need somebody humanistically to look at that. So I think we've cut it down to a couple hundred now. And we're in the process of, okay, our cyber, as part of defensive cyber operations, will look at this. The actual net will look at that. And that's huge because you can say it, you can say we're going to continuously monitoring, but if you have an impossible task, it's just one more unresourced task.
Right. To Neil's point, what are you monitoring? Because you can't do it all. And that's where, to me, the prioritization is another one of those keys that we ought to consider. Which things must I monitor every minute? Which things I check every 5 minutes?
And there's utility in, hey, we only need to have this when you stand the system up or you make a change. You don't have to continuously monitoring. Because when I send a cyber protection team to go get on the terrain and look for an adversary, it's a good start point, as well as the logs of what we're potentially monitoring when you have to get into crisis action.
But the thing to consider, though, is the entire conversation we've had thus far built to that as we've consolidated and improved the standards and established standards for the network that enable things like continuous monitoring to be established and now making it more effective.
Oh, absolutely. Try thinking that you're going to do continuous monitoring when you can only see the top level architecture, hundreds of places across Conus is loud.
You're watching the front door of your house, like all your back windows are open.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things with that is we talked about how services have changed too. We talked at the beginning a little bit about email. We used to have we had email servers down at the brigade level, and they came to the base level, and then we consolidated. So that takes something off the operator's plate. So I'm not sure, you know, at our cyber today, if they weren't monitoring email security because that was provided by DISA, the Defense Enterprise Email, but now that's coming back to the Army under Army 365. But it's being done through an enterprise IT as a service type contract. So is the onus still on the Army to monitor the security or to, I guess, manage the security, or is it on the contractor then as an enterprise IT?
It's interesting. We just did this work. We all assumed that the cloud was secure, right? And that was a bad assumption. So about 2 months ago, we stood up, the Army did a great job and stood up Enterprise Cloud Management Agency under Mr. Packard, and they're doing a great job of acquiring and getting some governance on how we're going to acquire cloud. We didn't do the requisite thing until about 2 months ago at my level. We stood up Enterprise Cloud Security Office that should be chalked up to Mr. Bucket's peanut butter to figure this out. And we just went through the responsible, accountable, I forget what the coordinating, and inform of how do you do this. And it's a shared responsibility is what we're finding, that there are certain tasks that the SOC, that the commercial service provider is providing. There are certain things that as a CSSP or governmental in nature have to be done. There's some auditing type things that have to be done for the environment. And then you have to pull stuff out of that environment and correlate it against how you're getting that environment. For instance, there's still an identity credential access management issue that is replicated in the cloud, but is out of cloud that has to be defended. But it's still completely dependent on your security in the cloud. That relationship makes it key terrain. So we have to defend that. That's something that's beyond what the cloud provider can provide you. So there's a lot of responsibility and tangential things that are forcing us to think differently. I think the other point to that is we're going to learn as we write these contracts. The initial couple of contracts we wrote for cloud, not so great at specifying that. For instance, can I take a CPT and put them on Microsoft's terrain or Amazon Web Services terrain because Army data is put at risk? I think the answer to that today is yes. But in some of the older contracts we wrote, that would be laughable. But because it's Army data, it's part of the DODIN, and we do have some responsibilities. Now, the way we do it might be a little.
Now, Mike, in your last job with the Pentagon, you were supporting a separate network, and we have lots of these what I'll call enclave networks across the DoD to support operations and also the business systems. Did you have to deal with some of the same things as you were developing either the policy or the procedures for that, or what were the things you were having, your biggest challenges there?
My biggest challenge right now is to make sure I keep it at the right level.
Yeah. I know
because of but I'm trying to generalize some of the things that we were doing, which is that a lot of our, unfortunately at that time, a lot of our security was security by obscurity. Or it was security by age, really. The networks were so old that many of today's adversaries don't know how to get into them anymore. So that provided a level of security, but it wasn't perfect. And just aside from that, everybody's focused on the nipper and the sipper, and there is nobody to watch the networks that I was responsible for. Absolutely nobody. And we pulled in a CPT at one point to focus on a specific thing and a specific network, and they had trouble mapping the network and actually understanding what it was supposed to be doing. They had to have a 2 or 3 hour briefing on what that network did. So but it was still essential, and it's going to be essential going forward because those particular networks, I'm talking about not just high availability, but essential availability through the most difficult and challenging environment you can imagine. It has to get the network, has to get the message through. Now, that message is small. It's in the kilobyte range, low numbers of kilobytes, but it has to get through. And so, therefore, we do a lot of. We have multiple ways of getting that message out, and we have through HF, through satellite, through leash lines, so all those different kinds of things. But at some point, somebody is going to figure out how to get into it, especially as we upgrade those networks to something that's more modern and something that is going to still have to be done in that challenging environment. It is and there's going to have to be somebody who's watching it. It is because it's as with something like AISR, there's a DISA portion, there's an Air Force portion, there's a Navy portion. Army has very little to do with that side of it, but in the future there's also going to be a Space Force portion, and bringing all that together under one roof to be watched, to be managed, to have high availability, to have the overwatch of our defenses on that network is that's going to have to be figured out.
That sounds like a big task, and I don't know.
It's a huge task.
Yeah, and now, so Colonel Katad, now, I know you just stood up a branch called the Unified Network Operations Branch.
Right.
I'm not sure what the scope of that's going to be, but I know that a lot of the conversation here at this conference is around JADC2, Unified Network Operations, Unified Networks in general. As we all know, there's a number of different networks. We've talked about the GuardNet, we've talked about the business network, the tactical network, and the operational network for the Army. How do we get a hold of the operational idea or concept of actually managing these networks and having the visibility?
Well, I'm sorry, I was stepping in, but one of the things to remember about JADC2 is that a lot of it is data focused.
Yeah.
And where is the data, who needs the data at the right point to make the right decision. Then there is the network portion.
How's that data going to move?
To get it out there to where it needs to be. And that could be from a BCT headquarters down to a platoon leader, down the way down from a platoon leader to a ship to an aircraft. And those are those challenges that are starting to come out under JADC2 and that framework. So you add into that, JADC2 is just that. It's a framework. It's a way, it's policy and governance, and the services are moving out on doing their own thing that fits JADC2, but there's still some focus on each of the individual service requirements.
So is that what UNO is kind of doing, or?
Yeah, I think General Morrison laid out a pretty good vision.
Yeah, he did.
He laid it out. It's a unified network, and we're going to build commonality. Now, a couple of common themes there, right? The manner in which you must connect may be different, but the level of service and the data aggregation is what it is. It's going to move, and it's going to be a common network. So what does that mean? Well, we've been directed to go to a zero trust architecture. That's not different in the tactical space and in the enterprise space. We're working those two things simultaneously. The where you put the servers and the proxies and the this and the that may be different based on how much size, weight, power you have in Humvee versus where does it make sense for the data to aggregate. It might make sense to aggregate it in the regional hub node, pull all that sort of stuff in. No different than the JADC2 type data. Those are natural collection points for the data. So I think I have rearranged to put the tactical and the strategic together to do two things. One, we're moving half of that cells, creating zero trust architectures and ways forward in both those spaces. The other is, and this mirrors what General Stanton is doing at the Cyber Center of Excellence, they're writing requirements documents for those things, and one of them is, what are those cross-cutting capability sets? So you look, the Army's been really good at capability set 21, 22 for our brigade combat teams and our divisions. This one's going to have this thermal widget, and that flamethrower, and that, all that cool stuff that we love the Army for. We've got to start thinking through what are those cross-cutting capabilities that go from foxhole all the way back to your fort. And that's the other part of what the UNO branch does for the Army in building out those cape sets. And then when they're different, the data's got to be on the right schema to be interoperable because of the physics of how we're connected. So that's kind of where we're going to try to put some teeth into what General Morrison was talking about, build out those architectures, and then defend it common. See it, defend it common.
Yeah. Well, I like to say, the more things change, the more things stay the same. So it really comes down to technology, people, and processes. And James, I'm not sure if there's any questions out there. I see we've got about 10 minutes left. So I guess I'll quickly ask you if there's any questions out there.
I'm not seeing any particular questions yet in the attendee chat window. So folks, what questions do you have for our colonels and for Ken? There was one discussion that came up earlier. When it comes to being proactive, is it monitoring that will get us out of a lot of this mess? By monitoring, I mean, whether it be enhanced intrusion detection or whether it be better SIM usage, or is that what could have solved some of the problems, say, with SolarWinds, or is it something else? So there was one of the questions that was kind of floating around while other people are asking.
From a certain perspective, yes, it is monitoring, but it is monitoring that's followed up with a process by which you say, okay, if I'm monitoring and I see this particular event happen 100 times, 200 times, well, maybe it's something that I need to automate. And so my process doesn't become how do I just respond to an event. My process becomes how do I develop that automated fix action to get after it. So that's part of it. Monitoring is just the beginning step to get after your internal processes for how you respond, whether you just do it as a one-off or you develop something that's an automated fix action or an automated block. So that's, and understand my perspective is still from a while ago, but that has to be part of it. Plus, I believe in the future, going forward, we're going to have to figure out a way. How do we monitor for something that is as yet unknown, and still deal with it in an automated fashion, even though we may not completely understand it. But I hope that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense to me. Any follow-up from others?
So things that Mr. Morrison said at the end of the first hour included the notion that zero trust is a way of thinking. So if you want to be proactive, you've got to have the right mindset for you, your whole team. Are you assuming risks and threats are out there and real? I think that will start to enable initiatives that help you identify those things quickly, and then get into exactly what Mike was talking about.
I think we've got to get out of the tripping over ourselves on the known bads, right? We spend so much time on basic Patch Tuesday chasing that rabbit and taking way too long. And I think some newer technologies and techniques like CompTIA Connect, if you are not patched to the latest baseline, you're just not getting on the network. There's only so much data and sensing and monitoring that the human brain can take, even with that analytics and machine learning and AI and all that sort of business. So as long as we're chasing that rabbit, we're not getting after the hard problem. So I think first you got to eliminate that. Furthermore, I think you've got to, and we kind of discussed it before, get the network tasks as simple as possible where you have to distribute them amongst a large workforce. And then invest in those people that are doing the higher level complex tasks, really get them good at what they're doing. Then when you've got those two things set, you can really use the big data. You got the right sensor strategy out there, you're pulling the right things. You can train the systems to look at those things that aren't routine, that are really anomalous that you care about. So the fact that somebody from China is getting into a resource that we actually care about that manages money, probably something we ought to take a look at versus chasing Patch Tuesday and tweaking our systems to do that sort of thing to get the higher analytic, I think is really where we win.
That makes
say this. Our PM systems need to be rewritten. They need to be rewritten in software so that they're not so brittle when it comes to Patch Tuesday.
Yeah.
They need to be written with security in mind from the start. That's one way. It's a response, but it's also a proactive measure. Write those PM systems so that they are not so brittle.
You're absolutely right. When I was in CENTCOM, the CJTF OIR adopted a very agile written suite of tools that did Intel, Common Operational Picture. I forget the name of the system. It was spun out of JSOC. And that thing patched just like regular Office IT because the complexity was back in the servers, but it was written common standards. And they were never having a problem. But you look at some of our intelligence systems, some of our operation systems, and the only way you're going to pass those cyber radius inspections is to unplug them and tell them to go patch and then get them back online when the inspectors are gone. That's no way to run a railroad. No.
Yeah, and one of the things you've heard here, James, is we've talked about technology, and I don't want to be this to be technology focused, but as we've seen over the past years of our careers, technology has become much better, and it enables us as cybersecurity guys from the past and present to be able to do these jobs better. And that's exactly what they're talking about now. It's like as we get new tools, new cyber capabilities, we're going to be able to, one, better operate and better defend our networks. And that's the great thing about what we're seeing here down at TechNet this week, is that there's a number of these new small companies, big companies, just with these great new technologies that are being deployed to help enable us, the soldiers, the businesses that are supporting the Army and the DOD to better protect and defend the networks. So it's great to see this stuff here. So,
let me ask a follow. Well, let me ask a follow-up there, because you excellent points here about automation, for example, but the specific job roles, real quick. What would be the names of some of the job roles of the people who do that kind of updating? The job role that comes to my mind is that of the threat hunter, which to a lot of people is a real whiz-bang thing, but I see that more and more, if not under that name, but more and more necessary to use the technologies that you're talking about to automate. Is that fair enough?
It's a logic train, right? I think a lot of threat hunting is, using a logical process and decomposing what a software does. So first you want to look at your edge. Even though we're trying to get away from edges, but you got to start somewhere. What's the most exposed? And look there and scan for a vulnerability that you know of. Then you go inside of your network and you scan there. But you've got to find the right hash, the right behavior, the right analytic that you're looking for with the tools that you have. And that's just a matter of, like, when we always get on a whiteboard to figure out, what does this malware do? How does it work? What are its stages? What does it see to? How can we detect which stage it's in? And what is the thing we're looking for? Is it a place? Is it an IP address? Is it a hash? What is it? It's always something different.
Sure.
It's probably different to look. So starting with a good logic base and then being able to code and script a little bit is very, very helpful to do that. And that, you're right. I think that is a growth industry. But I don't think everybody needs to know that. I think everybody should be familiar with that.
Right.
You too many cooks in the kitchen and you ruin the stew. You really have to have a professional workforce that can do that. And 1.4 million endpoints on five different continents, we have multiple work groups that should be doing that, getting good at that. But really train them to do that. I think the other thing that I think is really lacking is the data piece. So we have really good data scientists out there. They understand data analytics and how to code and how big data lakes work and all that sort of business. And I got some really good network defenders who know network security, understands how the DODIN works, but doesn't understand big data. And so I know this for a fact because I'm living in both spaces. They gave me operational oversight of our developers in the big data platform a few months ago. And when I got my master's in this business, there was no such thing as big data analytics, or it was kind of a sideshow. So I'm actually, after 27 years, having to go back to school for this, to build that middleware. How do I create a curriculum for network operators who understand the availability or how to patch things, to learn from the data scientists the things they need to know? I don't want them to know how to build data lakes. I don't want them to know how to build the analytic, know how to use them. Similarly, I think some of our data scientists need to understand how do you build this data that supports this middleware. I think your lecture on Cal IT hit it right on the head. Nobody's written the book on how to use AI and big data for defensive cyber stuff and cyber security. We're going to write that book, and that's where we need to put a lot of effort. Those are the hard tasks, I think, that need to get done.
I wanted to throw in a couple things in the last minute and a half. Bouncing off of what you said, what I had a lot of success with at the CONUS TNOS were the guys that were my process developers. Those people that managed how processes were measured and then adjusted to improve the metrics for how we responded to incidents, how we did our change management, how we did all of those different things. Those, while it's not the sexy part of IT management or cyber security, it's an essential piece to make sure that your organization that's doing those things is running as efficiently as possible. I had great success, and it's part of the reason that the opponents TNOS, and it's part of the reason why we were able to pivot to be able to manage the rollout of enterprise email at the time.
So James, it looks
Excellent.
like we're right at the top of the 60 minutes we have for you. So just to let everybody know, we are across the street from where TechNet is and what's referred to as the Delta House. Feel free to come over here anytime. Now we're here, we can answer questions. If we're still here, we have on the other side of the monitor here and the camera, we've got food and drinks. So come on over and come join us. And there's been a great event here. And James, thank you and the guys from CompTIA for helping to do this. This has been really great.
Thank you.
Ken, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Colonels Haggard, Ken, and Young. I really appreciate your time, the fantastic insights. I'm a little worried about you inviting people over to the Delta House for drinks. I guess I've seen Animal House before. But other than that, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
We're dealing with the change.
All right. Well, thank you again very much, folks. All the best.
Cheers.
Cheers. Well, next, folks, on our hit parade is we've had, let's see what we've had, Jim Morrison. We've had Mr. Whipple from the Sharma commercials. We've had a visit from the Delta House. Now we have Dr. Phil with us. How you doing, Phil?
Good. How are you, James? Good to see you, sir.
Good to have you here. Where are you calling in from exactly? We've had people from all over, from Augusta to Houston to Salt Lake and Olympia even.
I am right outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland.
All right. Well, fantastic. Great place to be. Folks, for this third hour, we're going to be talking about specifically supply chain issues having to do with the cloud and from Phil's experience. Phil, just 1 second. I want to make sure everybody can hear us. Can everybody hear us? Put it in the chat window if you can hear us. Really want to see that. Can everybody hear us? Hello? Just want to make sure. So if you could put into the attendee chat window, if you can hear us just before we move on, I want to make sure you can hear us. I can certainly hear you, Phil. So, all right. And they can. Good. Okay. Just wanted to make sure, everybody, we're all good. So after that interruption there, folks, let's go ahead and start out. Phil, tell us a bit about yourself and your history, and let's get right into talking about some specifics about supply chain hacks and some of the best practices that can help us.
Sounds great. So again, as James mentioned, my name is Phil Fooster. I am the Senior Director for Public Sector at Rackspace. We are a multi-cloud provider and services company. I've been in the industry for about 36 years now, working in the public sector space, primarily in the federal space, and have been with companies like Dell and Next Computer at the beginning of my career, as well as many others in between.
Thanks so much, Phil, for the background. Phil, I would like to ask a couple of questions. I'm just going to delve right into this. So if you're like, hey, James, let me take a step back and, give some of your perspectives. But it's based on some of the things that were mentioned earlier. A lot has been said about zero trust, okay? And when it comes to supply chain, we all know that there's some sort of issue, no matter what we're doing in regards to computing, that somebody can poison the water hole down upstream from us. Does that make sense? I always liken it to some sort of a Western, like a John Wayne Western or whatever. What happens? The bad guy always poisons the river upstream, right? And is zero trust some sort of way to get rid of any worries about the supply chain? Like, well, we already know the supply chain, the water's poisoned, but zero trust will get us out of it. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, but it almost seems like some people are like pivoting to that, going, well, we're kind of messed up and we just have to go to a zero trust. And that seems to shift an attempt to shift the burden of proof or the burden of care from one end of the spectrum to the other. Does that make any sense to you, what I'm trying to get at?
No, yeah, absolutely it does. So, nothing that we've seen yet has been 100% effective, right? So yeah. You have to build a framework across the board. So in my experience, a secure supply chain really starts with your people, right? So
Okay.
good training, good certifications, understanding of frameworks, very key, right? Because the biggest threat you can create is the insider threat, and
Right.
that could be willing or unwilling insiders. Zero Trust creates the ability to secure that communication between that potential insider and your infrastructure, but it never, that individual still has to be secure. Then your hardware still has to be secure. We all remember what happened with Secure Micro and the scare that we had a couple of years ago around that. And I came from an OEM in a previous life, and today we make sure that what we use in our cloud goes through that secure supply chain process. So,
Okay.
Anything, and as you know, everything gets manufactured, somewhere else when it comes to electronics for the most part. So,
Yeah.
Anything that's got a programmable chip has to be looked at. And in that case, everything that was programmable was wiped and reset to a known good state prior to being implemented. And when
And that's an industry term, right? That's a major industry, a known good state, and their whole processes around that, right, Phil?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That equipment comes from offshore, goes through a facility, it gets set to a known good state before it is actually stood up, whether directly in a government environment or in a cloud environment, right? And when it comes to cloud isn't a destination, right? It's a business model. It's somebody else's hardware, that is being provided to you as a utility. So, you have to make sure that whoever your partner is for the cloud is looking at all that, because you can only do so much with wrappers to protect the
So let me
data.
stop you. No, okay, this makes perfect sense what you're saying. Like it's a utility. You're using somebody else's service. I like the idea of like you're streaming water again. So you got to know what's coming to you. What are some of those processes look like? And let's get deep into it, because here's my analogy. The Olympics just finished, right? And the Russian team was not allowed to attend, at least not in name, because of supply chain issues with whatever performance enhancing drugs. But it's to me, it's like the Olympics. It's like, okay, all the people get tested, but then the game always has become, how do you avoid, or how do you mask, how do the bad guys, as it were, mask the fact that they're cheating, right? How do the bad guys then, if everybody is offshoring hardware, how do they avoid that, that really smart company that somehow is able to game the system or mask something? So let's talk just in detail. Thanks, man.
Sure. So, backing up to, processes, a good design from day one is critical. Mm-hmm. Most of the design is still done here onshore. Mm-hmm. And then as you receive your infrastructure from offshore, you do a very detailed analysis of the equipment that's coming in. You also know what's programmable, what's not. And, you have to do very deep source code analysis to make sure that, what you are putting on there is pristine and secure. And you reset everything as it comes in. You reburn, basically, or reflash every motherboard that's coming across, every control board, in your storage or in other devices or network devices, et cetera. That all has to be pristine. And then you have to utilize a framework, right? And we have several government frameworks from FedRAMP in the cloud to CMMC, for the DIB. There's tried and true security frameworks that NIST has put into place that we all need to utilize.
And so those frameworks is something that basically is one of the reasons why compliance has been a big issue. I just want to bring some context in because everybody hears about GRC, for example, or any one of those three elements. That's kind of what we're talking about, right? I mean, as people talk about these standards and about GRC, aren't they really talking about supply chain, just in other words?
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about supply chain from every angle. And, again, that goes back to, why CompTIA is does what they do, because you train people, you certify people to understand the processes that have to be implemented along the way. That's why I said it all starts with people. And then you have to look at your partners and systems integrators, et cetera, to make sure that they also have embraced this. And we have now, things like CMMC that everybody's got to adopt.
When it comes to understanding as people are going multi-cloud, right? That's a term that's often used. We could even talk about hybrid, meaning that cloud with some installed with data center, all that. But let's talk about multi-cloud for a second. It's an attractive prospect for government agencies for various reasons. Let's talk about the attractions, but also the flip side. What are some of the pitfalls to think about?
Sure. So multi-cloud is really the only way forward because, certain workloads today operate faster or more cost effectively in certain environments, right? So, it's no different than custom built hardware in previous generations. Because again, cloud isn't, it's not a destination. It's a business model. It's simply a utility. So,
right.
Certain things may have run better on Dell equipment or HP equipment or in mainframes, right? This is no different. So it all comes down to you still have to STIG the equipment. You still have to have the right processes in place. Who you allow into your data centers. You can't be offshoring or nearshoring. So all of those things still have to be considered in multi-cloud, but it is a very effective way, if you think about it, to manage your IT infrastructure. Because today we all know that we're in the middle of the Great Resignation right now. So keeping talented people is very difficult, and you have to.
So you're saying it represents another supply chain issue. It's a good point.
It's another supply chain, absolutely, right?
I love that term, the Great Resignation.
Right now.
Yeah, I'm stealing that term, Great Resignation. Thank you. But keep going, man. Keep going.
Yeah. No. I was just going to say that you have, if you pick the right partner, right, they're going to have the right processes in place and the right frameworks that you can consistently deploy in the multi-cloud without worrying about, the ever-changing people landscape, right? It's still an issue, but it's minimal, or it's minimized. And frankly, multi-cloud, as we're all seeing, everybody's starting to implement, everybody's moving their workload, and the more secure it gets, the more workloads they're going to move over. And that's really I think the biggest challenge of multi-cloud is your secure framework. And yes, we have FedRAMP, but people have to follow it. People have to watch their sprawl, and there are costs that you have to go in and think about as you go into multi-cloud. You have to build a design from day one to take all these things into consideration. As many people found out, public cloud is not the panacea that we all thought it would be, because you have these massive data egress costs, right? And there are times you have to pull out your data and move your data, and when it comes to mission critical applications, you can't be worrying about how you're going to do that or what the cost is going to be. All those things have to be thought about up front.
I think one of the other things that people thought would happen, like they thought, well, costs will go under control because the cloud is so much simpler. And then, like you said, there's egress costs, or it depends on the vendor, right? Each vendor has their own spin on these costs. But let me ask you from a security perspective, we hear about attacks like side channel attacks, whether it be one VM to the next or from hardware. How real are those types of attacks? Are they just theoretical, or are they, no, James, these are real things that we need to be worried about from a supply chain perspective, let's say?
Very, very real, right?
Okay.
As I mentioned, you're going to be existing in the multi-cloud applications run, and things are hybrid. You have a certain amount that's on-prem. You might have applications that exist in specialty clouds, let's say an Oracle cloud or a Snowflake cloud, right? All those things, all those different infrastructures have to maintain the same level of security, and then you have to build that zero trust infrastructure between them all, right? Otherwise, if you don't plan for that up front, you're going to have those attacks that come in through through the underbelly or the weakest part or the weakest link in your chain.
So if that weakest link in the chain is, for example, on the hardware side, I mean, you discussed very nicely the software side as well, but the hardware side, because with a side channel attack, the classic definition is through measuring or analysis of physical parameters, you can somehow extract secrets from a chip or a system or somehow get information. So that could be the weak link, or it could be software development, change things. Is that fair enough?
That's fair. That's fair. And again, that's why, moving things, into a more virtualized and, encrypted virtualized environment has been so game changing in the industry. But again, when you look below the hypervisors, that's where you have to watch out and make sure you have the right process in place.
Very good, very good. And like you said, the physical process of physically sourcing this hardware, because so many people will talk about, hey, serverless, it's all serverless, right? People like to use that term nowadays, or they could talk about K8s or whatever, but at some level there is hardware around. I mean, right? It's going to go to hardware.
There's hardware, it's just somewhere else, and somebody else is managing it for you. It's key that, again, when you move to the cloud, people think they can just move to the cloud, but there still has to be management. There still has to be processes in place. There's still a massive amount of training, right? Because it's a different way of implementing your infrastructure out there. So you have to think about all that.
So from a training, maybe this is a training question, but there are all these mandates. You mentioned, for example, FedRAMP. There's Cloud Smart. There's all these things. So those are new complexities, right? What's the best way to manage them? Is it through training, or what are some? Or another way to ask that question: what are some of the first areas that you focus people on to say, as people try to manage those complexities of these mandates? What are some of the first steps that people can take to take a bite out of that?
Definitely training, picking the right partners. Our ecosystem, that we've built, we bring in the best, and we utilize the best in something we call elastic engineering. And it's a different way of looking at how you bring expertise to bear. So instead of hiring 6 security engineers and migration engineers, you get a pod. And that pod is, whoever you need that has those skill sets are in that pod. And I think that's a great way that partners can look at this, or integrators can look at this, because now you're providing value along the digital journey to the cloud, right? Because you have different needs that occur at different times in your journey to the cloud. And you get the best people at the right time in the right place. But again, it comes back to having the right skill set in our challenge, in our human resource challenge world, of having those people working, with different models like that elastic engineering pod is I think the way of the future.
And so when it comes to what are some of the specific skill sets? A lot of people in this audience are people who are like, look, I want to know for the next year, what to study. What are some of those skill sets, say, that would work well in that pod or in a multi-vendor, multi-cloud vendor environment?
what are the skill sets?
Yeah.
Sorry,
What are some examples? Yeah. Yeah.
Sure. So understanding, you have data, data environments, you have compute environments, you have secure frameworks.
Okay.
You have, you have all the different flavors as well. Those are all things you have to look at, and also you have to understand where you can put a workload, right? Not all workloads may be meant for the cloud. Some may be hybrid. Some may be in the cloud, but pulling their data from a private cloud or an on-prem cloud. So,
Yeah.
the FedRAMP framework is key now. I think everybody understanding CMMC, and because that is the way of the future and what will, eventually supersede, or augment FedRAMP. You have now versions of FedRAMP that are being implemented on the state and local side called State RAMP. And, I don't know if they'll end up being, I'm hoping they will be more of a FedRAMP light in the sense that they don't create these exorbitant cost barriers for ISVs or customers to move their workload into the cloud. But those are all things that need to be, trained on in the process. Zero Trust, again, one of the hottest areas, right? Making sure that you can ascertain who is logging into or who is accessing what data, right? And there's tons of new technologies in there. Beyond the encryption piece, there are things like microsegmentation, that provide things, or elements of Zero Trust.
Right.
And the more you virtualize, the more you have to look at that and manage your sprawl. Because as we all know, shadow infrastructure, shadow IT gets put up everywhere and creates, that soft belly I was talking about earlier.
When it comes to microsegmentation, does that involve mostly working with network or cloud devices having to do with the connections? In other words, from VLANs, that's the old way of looking at it, but also cloud zones and things, or is microsegmentation more involved than that?
It can be as minute as, what users are allowed access into what space. That's the beauty about microsegmentation is you have very granular control of data access and who should be authorized to see the whole picture. It's like compartmentalization, for all those familiar with clearances.
Sure.
We do that very specifically so that somebody can't see the whole picture and can't create a threat. The same thing is being done in the virtual world.
And that's being done in terms of data security, but it's also being done in terms of spreading of attacks, whether it be ransomware or some sort of, lateral movement. Is that fair enough, both in terms of data security and IT security?
Absolutely.
Another area that I think is interesting in regards to security seems to be APIs. I mean, it's API security. Is that an area that folks should be jumping into? It seems to me because as people move to the cloud, it's still applications, isn't it? And we need to know how those communicate with each other.
Yes. And if you see, there's a lot of middleware companies, whether it's Boomi or others out there that are FedRAMPing their environments, and their middleware as a service as well.
Okay.
Yes, I mean that's all part of that secure supply chain that we've been talking about. Is you have to look at all the different components and you have to make sure all of them are compliant.
And so that compliant, like for example, when it comes to API security, some of the biggest issues seem to be either poor or lack of encryption, a data in motion. And then simple misconfiguration. That seems to be another major issue. Are those the big two, or do you see any others as well in regards to API?
Yeah. I would say both of those are the two biggest ones that we see in our business. And misconfiguration is definitely the biggest one. That's why, something like a platform as a service, and there's lots of examples of this being done, whether it's what we do or what the government's doing with Cloud One, Platform One, having that platform that is, rock solid, and then you moving your workload on top of it and just having to worry about that component of security is one way to mitigate that risk.
Last week I was talking to a cloud architect for Northrop Grumman, and he was saying that some of the major issues remain around encryption, that there are a lot of companies and I'll say DOD organizations that are still not encrypting data at rest and data in transit, right? I mean, we all know that that's a good thing or whatever. From your perspective, why is that still a problem? Why does it not happen still? What are some of the reasons?
Yeah, cost. I would say cost is probably one of the biggest issues, and then performance would be another one. And you have to, organizations have to modernize their environment, so it's a chicken and an egg, right? You have to figure out, where you're going to get the budget in order to do it, and that's why cloud is becoming, absorbing OpEx versus capital expenditures is much easier, right? Different color money, you can do it much more quickly. And you're offloading that expertise, requirement to somebody else instead of your internal folks.
So the cost must do from the developer's perspective, like, okay, we've got to decide on what form of AES we're going to use, which cipher. And so in other words, it makes it so the developers, many of them not quite knowing how to implement this stuff, it just takes so much more time to develop what should be simple code. Is that fair enough?
Fair enough.
What the problem?
I mean, it's partially that, but it's also, it's upgrading the licenses, the appliances that you may have implemented to the latest and greatest, right? And you see that every day. You see folks that have, infrastructure that's 10, 15, 20 years old in some cases because they couldn't move off some mainframe or they couldn't move off of some other appliance that was mission critical. And, again, you create that soft underbelly that can be exploited very quickly.
I remember a discussion along those lines. It was, James, we'd love to move over to that really cool cloud service, but we haven't paid the mainframe off yet. I mean, that literally was the discussion, right? And so the discussion turned positively into how we can upgrade the software to handle that the better encryption, right? That was a positive result. But so what do the best companies do to manage this? Is it go back to the pod like you were talking about? You just say, oh, look, we're going to leapfrog that particular bird's nest and solve it that way? Or what are some of the best ways that companies manage that issue?
In the government, I see that, that happens because when they shift the burden onto the integrator. So,
okay.
They shift that burden into industry in their new requirements. The industry has to then provide that solution, right? So it puts the burden back on us. It puts the burden on the other, when it comes to cloud anyway, to the cloud services providers, or to the integrator that is building a custom built solution for that mission.
Okay, so the burden goes on them. Which does that drive this kind of like you're talking about the storm of resignations, as it were? People are going from integrator to integrator just to get a better job doing this. Is that how that works? With
a negative unemployment rate in the IT industry, I would say there's a lot of folks out there that are guns for hire. You also mix in what's happened in the last year with COVID, and you've had a lot of people that have gotten Zoom fatigue, and they have decided that they want to do something a little different. You have a perfect storm of things coming together that have driven this. But even prior to that, we had a negative unemployment, rate in this industry. Talent's always been, especially technical talent. There's just not enough folks with the technical skills needed to address all of this. So, one of the reasons that AI tools and anything that reduces human touch is becoming so critical.
Okay. What are some of those skills then that are the most easily automated, right, in regards to supply chain? What are some of the skills that are the least automated? And I think you and I before have talked about how, a lot of workers are having to move up the supply, not to move up the supply chain, but move up the skills stack, as it were. Is that fair enough?
Yeah. So I would think that, anything around cyber, right, are probably the most desired out there. And a lot of that has to be done manually. There's AI that you could put in there for things like malicious activity, right? Threat patterns. Right. But actually, building out frameworks, the architecture side, that's all still very much a manual process. We can do things like deploy a new environment almost fully automated, right? You put a ticket into ServiceNow as a customer. In our system, it says, okay, it's going to deploy in this cloud, add it to the fabric. Now you have visibility, to this new environment, and you migrate your data in. Okay. Those things are easy, to automate and put machine learning capabilities in. But actually the architecture design work, all the things around kind of best practice and customization, like the areas around APIs, for example, an area where we just can't find, all the right talent. And it's very hard, and it forces a lot of offshoring and nearshoring. And as we know, in our government business, we can't do that. Commercial is easier to do that. But then you introduce other supply chain risks.
So you basically have this kind of double whammy of cost savings thinking, lack of talented employees, and you've got major bottleneck, right? That's one of the major bottlenecks there.
Yep. And, today we do, 65% of our deployments are automated. So that still leaves 35% with 125,000 customers globally that we have to handle with our employee base.
Okay, so people can get spread pretty thin. All
exactly.
Right. Let me ask you a question when it comes to automation specifically. Which jobs do you think will be automated the most readily? It sounds like reviewing of network architectures won't be automated particularly quickly, if ever, it sounds like, right? That the person who at least 10 years ago read through a Visio, file and said, okay, here's where things are, here are some issues with it. Is that being automated at all, or is that still a very manual process?
Very manual process. And then you have, where is a workload, things that I expect to see, because we're trying to get to over 80% automation, is like, right. Where's a workload going to run best? Where is it cheaper to run? Because the competitive aspect of all of this is still there. So you want to be able to serve your customer in the best possible way and provide them the fastest, least expensive solution out there. So the areas that are mostly going to be automated are the ones that were very, things like order entry, right? Order entry used to be a very manual process. It's almost fully automated now, or it's even pushed back on the customer and they enter their order and everything, stands up from that standpoint. It's the work that I mentioned earlier, which is the design work, everything up front, where you have to build that automated process, is still the pieces that are very manual.
So that means from a skills perspective.
From a skills perspective, those are the areas.
That's why we. Okay. That's why we need cloud engineers I should say cloud architects, being a very important perspective, network architects. And from a kind of an advanced security perspective, we need people who can say, okay, I see what was automatically done. Right. And here's the problems that seem to have occurred now. So, after automation happens, here's how we have to clean things up. What are some of those things that automation can kind of ignore? What are some of the issues that, okay, if you said a large percentage of things are now automated, what are some of the things that as people go in, okay, I see what automation tried to do here or should have done, but didn't? Is that where the pen tester comes in, for example?
Absolutely. That's definitely where a pen tester comes in. I mean, everything's still being designed by a human. So it's not, human error can still take place. And, the more AI and ML we inject into there, the better it will be, but it's never, we're still fallible humans that, will make mistakes and, bad design, bad implementation, and you create a target for somebody.
And it also seems to me that with AI, it has to be properly primed. Otherwise, you end up with AI thinking, okay, here's the baseline I'm starting from. And then if it's a bad baseline, then things go catawampus pretty quickly. I've seen that happen before.
Oh, yeah.
Let me see if there are any particular questions here, folks. Attendees, any questions? There are a couple here I have, but any more questions for Phil in discussing what it means to handle supply chain type issues? From your perspective, we're seeing so many attacks every day, right? What is that telling you about what people have been habitually doing about supply chain? I mean, whether it be, what was it? Accenture got hit. We can go back to, ancient history of things 2 weeks ago. I mean, what, from your perspective, are, I have an idea of what people are not doing habitually.
Great question. And now you put me on the spot. What?
Well, the question was basically, why are we seeing such an increase of attacks? And I kind of flavored it up a bit.
We're seeing an increase of attack because there's a ton of money in it, right?
Okay.
And nation states are pumping that ton of money in it. And if you look at, it's like go back to the 80s. Why is drug use still up? Because there's a lot of money there, right? And
sure.
The same is starting to happen with data. Data is the new currency. And, having data both for personal gain or personal criminal gain and nation state gain are huge. Look at the the attacks on Marriott years ago and on United.
Right.
If you start looking at correlating that data, where pretty much workers are traveling to at any one particular time. So you have very valuable data when you start data mining that. And I think one of the areas that people are laziest in, and it's it's something I try to take seriously, but even your passwords, utilizing your passwords across so many platforms, it's a very difficult thing, right? And we all get lazy. We write them down next to our desk. We use the same one across most, and it gets really tough. And password managers aren't quite there yet, and in some cases we just don't trust them. So, all those things come into play.
One of the things that I have seen, I remember years ago, as the Google CEO at the time said, look, from our study of metadata, we know you probably better than you know yourselves. It was a pretty strong statement there. You can only imagine what nation states, after being able to, like you said, break into various organizations, what they're able to extract in terms of your habits, my habits, troop movements, the whole.
Just look at Facebook and see how it starts marketing to you. And, you may have said, cat food an hour earlier when you were on your Facebook page, and all of a sudden you're being fed cat food advertisement, right? Those things are real. And again, think about what a nation state can do, right?
Indeed.
It's incredible, right? And that's your soft underbelly. People are always a soft underbelly when it comes to security. And so, teaching people, training people is key.
Well, thanks so much,
then,
Phil. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, and then testing those people to see if they are following that. We
actually know what the heck is going on. Yeah.
We do phishing attacks on our own people all the time just to see who is practicing good hygiene.
That's right. And it's non-punitive. It's not like they're going to go after Phil or James. It's just going to be, well, this happened and here's what you can do to solve the problem, that particular problem. Right? So it's interesting. So thank you very much. I mean, we started discussing when it comes to, supply chain hardware. We then started talking about software, about APIs. And then, of course, throughout, we've been talking about the importance of people and training. So, Phil, thank you so much for your wisdom in on this. Do you have any things to close with before we end this particular day?
Thank you to everybody who attended today, and thank you for listening to me babble. It's been great. And James, as always, great talking to you, my friend.
It's always fun. Thank you so much, Phil. Really appreciate it and your perspective from your experience at Rackspace and elsewhere. Special thanks also to GDIT and to HPE for your work today. Everyone, have a great time. See you next year at AFCEA there in Augusta. All the best. We'll also be seeing you in Baltimore, folks. So stay tuned. All the best, everyone. And this will conclude our presentation. If you want, you can contact me via any of these methods that I put up here. My email, for example, jstanger@comptia.org, if you have any questions for any of the panelists that we have. Also, you can contact me on Twitter, and that's at James Stanger, or even LinkedIn. So thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it. And Phil, again, thank you so much for your time. It was absolutely outstanding. All right, take care, everyone, and we'll catch you on the flip side. Bye-bye.
Thanks, James. Bye-bye.
You bet, man.